What would you do? If death wasn't the end? A mercenary, broken by betrayal, cut down on the battlefield, opens his eyes to find himself young again. The scars are gone, but the memories of war remain. This time he knows every enemy's face, every blade that will stab him in the back, every disaster waiting to unfold. And he swears one thing: I won't just survive. I'll rewrite the game itself. The night over the island did not feel natural. It was not the silence of forests or the whisper of waves. It was the stillness of a cage, stretched across the heavens like iron forged into constellations. Each star glimmered with a cold fire, chained to others in impossible patterns, as though the sky itself was bound and watching. Beneath that sky, the mountain loomed. Its stone ribs split into corridors and chambers that swallowed light and gave nothing back. They called this place the Trial of Chains and Stars, though few who entered ever spoke of it afterward. Dozens of candidates were led to its mouth. Prodigies, scions of families that held power like weapons, and chosen ones whose sparks burned above them like miniature suns. Sparks, small floating flames tethered to their souls, flared proudly, casting light into the darkness as if daring it to resist. Every prodigy carried themselves as though the trial was already theirs to master. Their hands glowed with fire, lightning coiled at their fingertips, blades shimmered with power. The mountain had always been a place where arrogance came to be tested. But amid the blaze of light and certainty, one figure lingered in the shadows. Songyun, his spark hovered faint and dim above his head, trembling as though a breath might extinguish it. It gave no warmth, no power, only a reminder of how fragile his existence was compared to the brilliance around him. He bore no weapon of legend, no aura of dominance. Only tired eyes, clenched fists, and the quiet weight of a vow no one else could see. The trial began with a descent into a vast corridor. Chains dangled from the ceiling, their metal whispering as though alive. The candidates pressed forward, sparks casting long shadows across stone. At first, the air carried nothing but the echo of footsteps and the brash laughter of the gifted. But then, the chains moved. One link rattled. Another snapped taut. Then dozens, hundreds, slithering like serpents awakened from centuries of sleep. They lashed downward, striking with impossible speed. The prodigies met them with brilliance flames flared, lightning carved arcs of radiance, swords cleaved through links with sparks of steel. For a moment, the corridor became a storm of power, each prodigy roaring defiance. And still, chains fell. For every link shattered, two more coiled. A boy wrapped in flames screamed as iron pierced his defense, dragging him into the dark. A girl's lightning fizzled when her spark was smothered beneath a wave of chains. She vanished with a gasp, her brilliance extinguished. One by one, sparks winked out, swallowed into silence. Sungyun staggered, his body nearly crushed beneath the weight of falling iron. He raised his arms not to fight, but to shield his head. His spark flickered wildly, dimming until it seemed ready to vanish. The prodigies surged ahead, uncaring, leaving him behind. He stumbled, chains scraping his skin, burning his breath away. Every instinct screamed at him to give up. He was too weak, too slow, too ordinary. But within the roar of chains, his vow whispered louder. I will carry, even if I cannot conquer. Instead of striking back, Sungyun bent his shoulders. When chains coiled around his chest, he did not thrash, he bore them. When they tightened at his throat, he did not scream, he endured. Pain racked his body, his knees buckled, his vision blurred. But through the haze of agony, his spark clung stubbornly to life, trembling yet unbroken. The chains hesitated. For a heartbeat, their rhythm faltered, confused by prey that did not resist. Around him, others still fought, still burned bright, but Sungyun endured. And in that endurance, the chains slackened, sliding from his arms as if testing him, weighing him. His spark dimmed further, no larger than a thread of light, yet it lived. When the last of the chains withdrew into the ceiling, silence fell again. Fewer than half the prodigies remained, their sparks flickering with exhaustion. Some wept openly, their pride shattered. Others clutched their weapons tighter, as if to deny the truth of how close they had come to death. Sungyun collapsed to his knees, his body shaking. Blood stained his lips, sweat soaked his skin, but his spark hovered faintly still, refusing to die. The others barely noticed him. To them, he was a shadow, a remnant, an anomaly. But in the eyes of the mountain, the trial had already marked him, not for brilliance, but for bearing. The corridor stretched onward, darker than before, chains rattling faintly in the distance. The trial was far from over, and Sungyun, fragile and trembling, stood again. Not because he believed he could win, but because surrender was not a language he knew. The survivors of the first ordeal pressed deeper into the mountain, their sparks flickering like wounded lanterns. The silence that followed the chains was not peace. It was anticipation, the pause a predator takes before striking again. The corridor narrowed, the walls wet with condensation, the air heavy as if soaked in the breath of centuries. At first, they thought it was only a tunnel, but soon they heard it, the faint trickle of water. The sound grew louder until the corridor opened into a cavern vast as a cathedral. Its ceiling vanished into darkness, and across its width stretched an underground river, black as obsidian, moving with deceptive calm. A narrow bridge of stone, slick and jagged, stretched from one bank to the other. The prodigies, still flushed with the pride of survival, did not hesitate. Sparks flared brighter, flames casting reflections across the black water, lightning flashing along the edges of their blades. They stepped onto the bridge with the confidence of those who believed themselves chosen. Sungyin lingered at the back, his spark trembling faintly above him. His chest still ached from the weight of chains. His knees threatened to buckle with every step. The river's surface rippled as he approached, though no wind touched it. He felt its hunger immediately. This was no water. This was a mirror. The first scream tore across the cavern when a prodigy stumbled. The water surged upward, pulling her reflection from the surface like a hand dragging cloth. A figure emerged her double, perfect in every detail, save for the emptiness in its eyes. It struck with impossible speed, seizing her throat. Her spark flared once, then was swallowed by the river as both bodies fell beneath the surface. Panic erupted. One by one, reflections rose from the water, shadows of those who crossed. Each spark summoned its opposite, a twin birth from fear and pride, from hidden truths and silent doubts. The cavern thundered with the clash of self against self. Fire met fire, lightning tore lightning apart. Blades rang against their own echoes. Sungya stepped onto the bridge, heart hammering. The water beneath him stirred, and from its depth rose his own image. Pale, trembling, spark barely visible. But the eyes of the reflection were cruel, filled with scorn. It whispered in a voice that cut sharper than any blade, "You are nothing. You cannot protect her. You cannot even stand." The reflection lunged, its frail fists striking with unnatural strength. Sungyin staggered beneath the blow, nearly cast into the river. His spark trembled violently, threatening to gut her out. Fear clawed at him. This was no faceless chain, no nameless beast. This was himself. Stripped of every excuse around him, others fought desperately. Some triumphed, shattering their reflections with sheer will. Others faltered, dragged screaming beneath the black surface, their sparks consumed. The bridge became slick with water and blood, the cries of combat echoing through the cavern like the dirge of fallen stars. Sungyin fell to his knees, his reflection looming above him. He could see nothing but contempt in its eyes, nothing but truth in its voice. Every failure, every weakness, every helpless night when he had clutched So-Yoon's fragile hand and promised he would not let her slip away, those promises rang hollow here. His fists shook. He had no weapon, no strength, only the vow that had carried him through the chains. "If you will not open," he whispered, echoing his own words. "Then I will carry you with me." The reflection faltered, its scorn flickering into uncertainty. Sungyin reached forward, not to strike, but to grasp. He seized the reflection by the wrist, pulling it into himself. Pain lanced through him, cold as the river's depths, but he did not let go. His spark dimmed to a thread, nearly extinguished, but he endured. The reflection shuddered, then dissolved into light, sinking into his chest. For a moment, Sungyin felt heavier, as though he bore the weight of his own failures. But the weight was not unbearable. It was honest. The river stilled. The bridge lay slick and silent, dotted with fewer figures than before. Of the dozens who had entered, only a handful remained, their sparks guttering but alive. They crossed in silence, their arrogance stripped away, their eyes hollowed by what they had faced. Sungyin staggered to the far bank, his body trembling, his breath ragged. His spark hovered faintly above him, weaker than ever, but steady. He had not conquered his weakness. He had chosen to bear it. The cavern's far wall groaned, stone shifting to reveal another passage. The survivors stepped into the darkness, the sound of the river fading behind them. But its memory lingered, the memory of facing themselves, and of what it meant to carry even that dot for Sungyin. The trial was no longer about surviving the mountain. It was about surviving himself. The survivors emerged from the river cavern into a passage so narrow their shoulders scraped stone. The air was stale, heavy with the weight of silence, and the faint glow of sparks painted the walls in trembling shadows. They walked slower now. Pride had been stripped from their steps. Every face carried the hollow look of those who had seen themselves and nearly The corridor twisted and widened until it opened into a vast amphitheater carved entirely of stone. Tier upon tier of statues lined the circular walls, hundreds, perhaps thousands, each figure bound in chains, their heads bowed as though in eternal judgment. At the center of the arena stood a dais of cracked stone, its surface scarred by marks of countless battles. When the last of the survivors stepped into the chamber, the doors sealed with a groan of rock, shutting out every sound except the faint rattle of chains. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. The statues remained still, their hollow faces hidden beneath iron masks. Sparks hovered anxiously, dim flames trembling as if sensing what was to come. Then the statues raised their heads in unison. The sound of chains scraping stone roared through the amphitheater. One by one, they stepped down from their perches, descending toward the dais. Their eyes, empty sockets filled with pale fire, fixed upon the living. The prodigies did what they always did. They fought. Sparks blazed, flames surged, lightning cut arcs of brilliance through the air. Blades flashed and voices roared, the chamber exploding into chaos. Stone shattered beneath the force of spells. Statues crumbled under steel. For a moment, the survivors believed they could win. But for every statue broken, another rose from the shadows of the amphitheater. Chains lashed like whips, binding wrists, throats, and sparks alike. A boy screamed as his spark was dragged from his body, extinguished in the hollow eyes of a mask. Another fell silent as chains coiled around her chest, pulling her into the crowd of statues until she was indistinguishable from them. The amphitheater was not a battlefield. It was a judgment hall. And the statues were not enemies to be slain, but verdicts to be endured. Sungyun stumbled into the fray, his lungs burning with dust and smoke. His spark flickered faintly, so dim it seemed ready to vanish. Chains lashed toward him, faster than thought. Instinct screamed at him to fight, to resist, to flee. But he remembered the river, remembered his reflection's scorn. He bowed his shoulders and braced himself. The chains struck, coiling around his arms, his chest, his throat. The weight drove him to his knees, crushing breath from his lungs, forcing blood from his lips. His vision swam with fire and darkness. Yet he did not scream. He endured. Around him, the prodigies struggled desperately. Some fell, their sparks ripped away, their bodies claimed by stone. Others raged, their brilliance burning brighter in defiance, but even the brightest sparks guttered against the endless tide of chains. Sungyun's spark dimmed until it was no more than a thread of light. He felt it tremble above him, fragile as a candle in the wind. But he refused to let it die. "I will carry," he whispered, voice raw. Even this. The statues faltered. The chains binding him slackened, their weight shifting as though confused by his submission. The pale fire in their hollow eyes flickered, uncertain. For a moment, the amphitheater stilled, the roar of chains falling into uneasy silence. Sungyun forced himself upright, blood staining his chin, his body trembling. He met the gaze of the statues, not with defiance, not with arrogance, but with endurance. His spark, though faint, steadied. The statues slowly lowered their heads once more. Chains withdrew into the stone, dragging the fallen with them. The amphitheater emptied, leaving only silence and the ragged breaths of those who remained. The survivors were fewer still. Their sparks hovered weak and battered, their eyes wide with the memory of what they had faced. Some clutched their weapons as though for comfort. Others stood in stunned silence. Sungyun collapsed to his knees, his body broken, but his spark hovered above him still. Faint, trembling, yet alive. The dais at the center of the arena cracked, stone splitting apart to reveal a stair descending deeper into the mountain. The trial had not ended. It had only shifted its weight onto fewer shoulders. Sungyun wiped the blood from his lips, forcing himself to his feet. His body screamed to stop, to rest, to surrender. But surrender had never been a language he spoke, and so, with his spark flickering faintly above him, he stepped forward once more into the darkness. The stair from the amphitheater spiraled downward like the throat of some vast beast, swallowing the survivors one careful step at a time. The silence here was absolute, so deep that every breath sounded intrusive, every heartbeat like a drum. Sparks floated weakly above bowed heads, their glow dim, unsteady. Like embers on the edge of vanishing dot, at last the stair opened into a cavern so vast the survivors could not see its ceiling. The air was thick and warm, carrying the scent of iron and smoke. In the center of the chamber yawned a pit, ringed with scorched stone. Chains hung limp around it, hammered deep into the rock as if once they had bound something. The survivors slowed, instinct warning them that this place was not empty. The warning proved too late. With a shriek of metal, fire erupted from the pit. Not the gentle warmth of torches, but a white-hot inferno that seared the air itself. Chains whipped upward, glowing red, writhing as though alive. From the flames rose a figure colossal and terrible, a giant forged of iron and fire. Its body a furnace, its eyes hollow furnaces of rage. Each breath it exhaled was a roar of molten fury. The prodigies reacted in kind. Lightning split the darkness, flames surged, blades flashed with desperate brilliance. Sparks flared bright as stars as they hurled their strength at the fireborn guardian. The cavern thundered with their defiance, their voices echoing as steel and will clashed against flame. But the giant did not weaken. Every blow only fed its fire. Lightning was consumed. Flames merged into its furnace. Blades glanced off as if striking the heart of the mountain itself. The harder they fought, the brighter the guardian blazed until the cavern became a storm of unbearable heat. One survivor screamed as the fire wrapped around him, his spark devoured in an instant. Another fell beneath chains that lashed like whips, dragged screaming into the blaze. The survivors dwindled as the inferno grew, the air thick with ash and despair. Sungyun stumbled back, his lungs scorched, his skin blistered. His spark quivered weakly above him, shrinking under the fire's suffocating breath. Panic clawed at him. He had no lightning to cast, no flames to resist. His body screamed to run, to collapse, to surrender. Then the ring on his arm pulsed. Not with power, not with command, but with rhythm. A reminder. What cannot be fought must be carried. Sungyun clenched his teeth, forcing his body forward. Every step was agony, the heat clawing at his lungs, the flames searing his skin. The guardian turned, chains lashing, fire surging to consume him. He did not resist. He bowed his shoulders and let the weight fall. The chains wrapped around him, burning into his flesh. The heat roared through his body until he thought he would be reduced to ash. His knees buckled, his vision blurred, his spark shrank to a flicker. But he did not scream. He did not strike. He bore. The fire giant shuddered. Its chains slowed, as though confused. The blaze dimmed, not quenched, but steadied, as if rage had found a vessel willing to bear it. The inferno hissed, its form trembling, until it recoiled back into the pit. With a final roar, the chains sank, the flames collapsing into embers that scattered like dying stars. Silence returned, broken only by ragged breaths. The cavern stank of smoke and blood. Of the survivors who had entered, only a fraction remained. Their sparks hovered weak and fragile, their bodies scorched. Sungyun collapsed to his knees, his arms blistered, his chest heaving. His spark trembled faintly above him, smaller than ever, but alive. The ring pulsed once more, as if acknowledging what he had endured. The others looked at him differently now. Not with pity, but with something closer to awe and fear. For where brilliance had failed, endurance had endured. The far wall groaned, stones shifting to reveal a new passage. The survivors rose, broken but alive, and stepped into the darkness. Sungyun staggered to his feet, every nerve screaming. He had not conquered the fire. He had carried it. The corridor beyond the chamber of fire sloped downward, narrow and suffocating. The air was cooler here, but not lighter. It clung to the lungs like wet cloth, pressing inward until each breath felt like a debt owed to the mountain itself. The survivors walked in silence, sparks hovering faintly above them, their glow dulled by exhaustion and fear. Every step echoed too loudly, as though the darkness listened. At last, the passage opened into another vast chamber, circular and symmetrical. The walls were lined with thrones, carved from the same stone as the mountain, each occupied by a figure cloaked in shadow. Hundreds of them sat in silence, motionless, faceless. Their presence filled the cavern like a weight, a court of ancient judges awaiting a trial that had already begun. The survivors froze at the threshold. Sparks flickered uneasily. Then, with a sound like the slow turning of stone, the faceless judges stirred. Their heads lifted in unison. Hollow eyes of pale fire opened, gazes piercing, merciless, eternal. The pressure descended immediately. It was not chains or flames this time, but a suffocating weight that pressed into their chests, crushed their lungs, and smothered their sparks. No enemy struck, no weapon fell, yet the prodigies screamed as though flayed alive. Their knees buckled, their sparks guttered violently. One boy collapsed instantly, his spark imploding into darkness. Another clawed at her throat, suffocating until her body crumbled into dust. The judges did not move. Their gaze alone was execution. Sungyun fell to his knees, the weight smashing into him like an avalanche. His chest burned, his vision swam, his spark shrank until it seemed ready to vanish. He felt exposed, naked, As though the judges peeled away every defense until nothing remained but the truth, the whispers began. Not in sound, but in thought. You are nothing. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself. Tears burned his eyes. His arms trembled, his body bowed nearly to the ground. He wanted to collapse, to let the silence consume him. Around him, sparks winked out one by one, victims of despair rather than battle. But in the suffocating dark, he remembered So-Yun's face. Her fragile hand in his, her smile faint but real when her eyes had opened. She had believed in him fragile, ordinary him, when no one else had. If she could believe, he thought, then I can stand. Blood filled his mouth as he forced his hands against the stone floor. His arms shook violently, his knees quivering under the unbearable weight. Slowly, agonizingly, he pushed himself upright. His head lifted, his eyes burning with tears as he met the hollow gaze of the faceless judges. I am weak, he whispered, voice breaking. But I will not fall. Not here. Not while I carry her. His spark flickered wildly, dimming until it was barely visible. For a heartbeat, it seemed ready to vanish entirely. Then it steadied. Fragile, faint, but unyielding, the pressure shifted. The judges leaned back, their pale fire eyes dimming. One by one, they stilled, returning to silence. The weight lifted, leaving only the echoes of ragged breaths. Only a handful of survivors remained standing. The rest were gone, their sparks erased as if they had never been. Those who endured trembled, broken, hollow-eyed. Sung-Yun swayed where he stood, his body trembling, his spark faint as ever. Yet it hovered still, refusing to die. In that dim light, there was something more enduring than brilliance, something the judges had acknowledged. The chamber's far wall split open, revealing another passage into the dark. The survivors stepped forward one by one, leaving the silent court behind. Sung-Yun staggered after them, his body screaming, his mind scarred. But his spark hovered, weak yet steady. He had endured the weight of judgment, and in endurance there was truth. The passage that opened from the hall of faceless judges felt colder, though no wind stirred within the mountain. The survivors' footsteps echoed hollowly, their sparks hovering faint above their heads like fragile lanterns nearly extinguished. No one spoke. Their pride had been ground into dust, their brilliance stripped to flickering embers. They had faced judgment and survived, but survival was not triumph, it was merely permission to keep walking. The corridor bent sharply and descended, the air growing damp and heavy. Soon the sound of dripping water broke the silence. The floor slickened and the survivors slowed, their steps careful. Then the tunnel widened, spilling them into a chamber vast and strange. A shallow lake filled the cavern, its surface still as glass stretching into darkness. Stalactites dripped from the ceiling, their slow rhythm punctuating the silence. In the lake's center rose a circular platform of black stone, connected to the shore by a narrow causeway. Carved into the platform's surface were concentric circles, their grooves faintly glowing with pale blue light. The survivors hesitated, sparks trembling. Something about the lake was wrong. Its surface reflected not only their sparks, but their movements. Their expressions, yet the reflections lingered a second too long, as though the water remembered what it saw. One prodigy stepped forward, fire swirling around her fists. She strode across the causeway with confidence, her spark burning bright. The moment her foot touched the platform, the water rippled violently. From its depths rose a figure, her reflection, identical in every detail save for the hollowness of its eyes. It lunged without hesitation, its movements sharp, merciless. The prodigy roared, striking with fire. The reflection mirrored her. Flame against flame, blow against blow. The chamber lit with brilliance as she fought herself. For a moment it seemed she might prevail. Then the reflection's flame consumed hers, dragging her screaming into the lake. Both bodies vanished beneath the surface, her spark extinguished in an instant. The others recoiled, horror spreading like frost. But it was too late. The lake rippled again and again, birthing reflections for each who stood upon the platform. Soon the chamber was chaos figures locked in combat with their own shadows, sparks flashing desperately against themselves. Sung-Yun staggered as his reflection rose from the water. It looked at him with scorn, its dim spark trembling but unyielding, its mouth twisting into a cruel smile. You are weak, it whispered, though no sound carried. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself. The reflection lunged. Sung-Yun stumbled backward, barely dodging the blow. His fists trembled as he raised them. He had no fire, no lightning, no weapon but himself, and his reflection was stronger in every way. The battle raged around him. Survivors screamed as their shadows overpowered them, dragged them beneath the water. Sparks winked out one by one, swallowed by the lake. The air filled with the sounds of desperation, of selves devouring selves. Sunyan's reflection struck again, its fists like iron. Pain blossomed across his chest as he collapsed to his knees. His spark trembled violently, shrinking until it was nearly gone. His reflection loomed above him, eyes empty, smile cruel. For a moment, despair clawed at him. The judges had stripped him bare, and now even his reflection denied him. What was left to endure? What weight could he possibly carry when even he himself was an enemy? Then he remembered Soyeon's hand, fragile, trembling, yet warm. He remembered her eyes opening after years of sleep, her faint smile, her trust. He remembered the vow he had whispered, "If you will not open, then I will carry you with me." His fists clenched. His arms shook. Slowly, painfully, he rose to his feet. Blood dripped from his lips. His body screamed to collapse, but he stood. He faced his reflection not with defiance, but with endurance. "I will carry you too," he whispered. The reflection faltered. Its cruel smile flickered into uncertainty. Sunyan stepped forward, arms trembling, and seized his reflection by the wrist. Pain seared through him as the shadow writhed, but he held on. His spark dimmed further, nearly vanishing. Yet it did not die. The reflection shuddered, then dissolved into light, sinking into his chest. For a heartbeat, he felt heavier, as though he bore the weight of his own failures. But the weight was honest. It was his, the lake stilled. The survivors who remained stumbled from the platform, their sparks faint, their eyes hollow. Fewer than half had survived. The rest were gone, consumed by themselves. Sungyun staggered onto the shore, collapsing to his knees. His spark hovered faint above him, trembling but steady. He had not conquered his reflection. He had accepted it. The far wall split open with a groan of stone, revealing another passage. The survivors rose in silence and stepped into the darkness. Sungyun followed, his body broken, his vow heavier than ever. But he carried it still. The new passage wound downward like the coiling of a serpent, narrow and suffocating. The air was colder here, damp with unseen moisture, and every footstep echoed, as though the stone carried it to unseen ears. The survivors moved slowly, sparks hovering faintly above them, their bodies weary, their eyes hollow. What had begun as a parade of brilliance had withered into a procession of ghosts. At last, the passage widened, revealing a cavern vast and strange. The floor was uneven, scattered with fragments of broken stone. In the center stood a single monument, a pillar of crystal taller than any man, its surface glowing faintly with pale starlight. Chains coiled around it like serpents, their links fused to the crystal's heart. The light within pulsed weakly, like a heartbeat fading. The survivors approached cautiously, sparks trembling. The pillar's glow seemed to reach for them, pulling at their sparks as though begging for something. One prodigy stepped closer, her hand brushing the chains. At once, the crystal flared with light. The cavern shook as the chains came alive, slithering outward in a storm of steel. The survivors scattered, sparks blazing in panic. Lightning split the darkness. Flames surged, blades sang against the rattle of chains. But the storm did not relent. For every chain shattered, more emerged from the crystal's heart, each strike feeding on the survivor's sparks. Sunyan staggered as chains lashed toward him, their weight crashing into his body. Pain flared, his spark trembling wildly. He fell to one knee, blood dripping from his lips. His body screamed to collapse, but he forced himself upright. His vow pulsed within him. "If you cannot open, I will carry you with me." The pillar's light pulsed again, brighter now, hungrier. He realized then it was not simply a prison. It was a heart, bound and starving, feeding on the sparks of those who came near. The more the prodigies resisted, the more they were consumed. One survivor screamed as chains coiled around her, dragging her spark into the crystal. Her body withered to dust as the light within flared brighter. Another struck with furious brilliance, his flames searing the cavern walls only to be smothered, his spark torn from him and devoured. Sungyun's spark flickered violently, shrinking as the chains closed around him. His body trembled, his vision blurred. He knew he could not overpower the storm. He could not burn brighter nor strike harder. But he could endure. He bowed his shoulders, letting the chains coil around him. The weight crushed his chest, seared his flesh, threatened to tear his spark free. Pain roared through him, a tide of agony that drowned thought itself. Yet he did not resist. He bore. "I will carry," he whispered through bloodied lips. "Even this." The chains shuddered. The pillar's light flickered, confused. Where brilliance had failed, endurance unsettled it. The storm slowed, its fury faltering. Sunyan's spark dimmed to a thread, trembling, but unbroken. Then, slowly, the chains withdrew, slithering back into the crystal. The light within dimmed, its hunger unsated, its fury quelled. The cavern stilled, silence descending once more. Only a handful of survivors remained, their sparks faint, their bodies broken. They stood in hollow silence, staring at the crystal with fear and awe. For all their brilliance, it had nearly devoured them. Sungyun collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, his skin blistered where chains had burned him. His spark hovered faintly above him, smaller than ever, but alive. The others looked at him with something new in their eyes, not pity, not scorn, but a recognition of the truth they did not want to face. The crystal pulsed once more, faintly as though acknowledging the endurance it had met. Then the far wall cracked, stones shifting to reveal another passage. The survivors stepped forward in silence, their sparks dim, their hearts heavier than before. Sungyun forced himself upright, his vow burning faintly within him. He had not conquered the storm. He had carried it. The survivors trudged onward, their sparks faint beacons against the suffocating dark. The new passage was carved differently than the others, narrower, with walls marked by deep gouges, as if claws had raked through stone. The air carried a scent of iron, sharp and metallic, clinging to the tongue like rusted blood. Each step forward felt like trespassing into a predator's lair. The tunnel opened suddenly into a cavern vast and jagged, its ceiling lost in shadow. Stalactites loomed like teeth, and the ground was littered with fragments of bone, ancient and brittle. In the center lay a hollow depression, its stone blackened and cracked as though scorched by fire long ago. Chains coiled along the walls, slack and silent, but the silence itself felt dangerous, like the stillness before a beast's strike. The survivors hesitated, sparks trembling. Then the ground shook. A low rumble spread through the cavern, rattling stone and bone alike. From the hollow rose a figure, monstrous and terrible, its body a patchwork of stone and iron, its limbs grotesquely long, its head crowned with jagged horns. Chains hung from its torso like broken manacles, and within its chest burned a furnace of pale fire. Its roar shook the mountain, a sound of rage bound in iron. Panic erupted. Sparks flared as survivors hurled their strength at the creature. Lightning carved across its chest. Fire seared its limbs, blades struck against its hide. The cavern thundered with brilliance, desperate and furious. For a moment, the survivors believed they could overwhelm it. But the beast did not fall. Every blow glanced off its iron flesh. Every flame was swallowed into the furnace in its chest. It surged forward, chains snapping like whips, scattering the prodigies as though they were insects. One survivor was caught mid-step, crushed beneath a sweeping arm. Another was bound by chains, dragged screaming into the furnace's blaze, her spark consumed in an instant. Sungyun stumbled back, the roar of the beast vibrating through his bones. His spark flickered faintly, trembling above him. Fear clawed at him. This was no storm to endure, no judgment to bear. This was a monster, vast and unrelenting. His body screamed to collapse, to hide, to surrender. But he remembered the fire giant, remembered the weight of chains, remembered the cold gaze of the judges. He had not conquered them, but he had endured. And endurance had carried him farther than brilliance ever could. The beast roared again, chains lashing toward him. He raised his arms, not to strike, but to shield. The impact drove him to his knees, pain flaring through his chest, blood spilling from his lips. His spark shrank to a thread, trembling. The chains coiled tighter, dragging him toward the furnace in its chest. Heat seared his skin, the air burning his lungs. Every instinct screamed to resist, to fight. But resistance had never been his strength. Bearing had. "I will carry you too," he whispered through clenched teeth, his voice breaking. The chains burned into his flesh, the furnace's heat engulfing him. His vision blurred, his body screamed to collapse. Yet he endured. He bowed his shoulders, let the weight fall, bore it until his spark trembled violently but did not die. The beast shuddered. Its chains faltered, its roar dimming. The furnace in its chest flickered, its fire wavering as though uncertain. Sungyun's spark, faint as a candle, steadied against the storm. The cavern shook as the beast staggered back, its body trembling. With a final roar, it collapsed into the hollow from which it had risen, chains snapping lifelessly as its furnace dimmed into ash. Silence returned, broken only by the ragged breaths of those who remained. Fewer than ever now, their sparks hovered weak and battered, their eyes hollow. They stared at Sungyun, not with scorn, but with a mixture of awe and fear. He collapsed to his knees, his body scorched, his breath ragged. His spark hovered faintly still, trembling but alive. He had not slain the beast. He had carried its weight until it broke. The far wall groaned, stone splitting open to reveal another passage. The survivors rose slowly, their steps heavy, their sparks dim. Sungyun forced himself upright, his vow heavier than ever, his body broken but unyielding. And once more he stepped into the darkness. The survivors pressed onward through the newly opened passage, their footsteps hollow against the stone. The air grew colder with each step, the dampness thickening until droplets clung to their skin and hair. Their sparks, faint and trembling, cast little light, and in that dim glow the walls seemed to close in tighter. Every breath sounded ragged, every silence heavier, as though the mountain itself leaned closer to listen. At last, the corridor widened into a cavern vast and bleak. Its ceiling soared unseen above them, but the ground stretched flat and smooth, polished as if by countless hands. The chamber was barren save for one thing, a circle carved deep into the stone floor, its grooves filled with pale light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Around the circle stood pillars of black stone, each chained, each carved with symbols that writhed when looked at too closely. The survivors hesitated at the threshold. Sparks hovered uneasily. Something about this place felt final, as though it was not simply another trial, but a measure of their essence. One prodigy, desperate to prove their strength, stepped into the circle. The light flared instantly, swallowing them in radiance. For a moment, their spark blazed brilliantly, brighter than it had since the trial began. Then, with a sound like glass shattering, the light collapsed. The prodigy crumpled, their spark extinguished, their body gone as if erased. Terror spread through the group. Yet the circle pulsed again, beckoning. It demanded not strength, but presence. One by one, the survivors were drawn in. Some lasted only seconds before their sparks were torn apart. Others endured longer, their brilliance flashing like dying stars before vanishing into the dark. The circle devoured without mercy, testing not their power, but their will to exist against annihilation. When Songyun's turn came, his legs trembled as he stepped into the circle. The pale light surged, rising around him like a tide. His spark flickered violently, shrinking to a fragile thread. His chest burned, his body screamed to collapse. The light whispered to him, not with words, but with certainty. You are nothing. You cannot carry. You do not belong. Pain lanced through him, tearing at his essence, threatening to unravel him entirely. His vision blurred, his knees buckled. His spark dimmed until it was nearly invisible. A single ember in a storm intent on snuffing it out. For a moment, despair nearly claimed him. He remembered every failure, every moment of weakness, every time he had fallen short. He remembered the scorn of others, the contempt of his own reflection, the weight of judgment pressing him to the ground. He was nothing, the light told him, and it was right. But then he remembered So Yoon's smile. Fragile, faint, but real. He remembered the warmth of her hand in his, the trust in her eyes, the vow he had whispered when no one else had listened. If you will not open, then I will carry you with me. The ember of his spark trembled and steadied. It did not blaze, it did not roar. It simply endured. Sungyun bowed his shoulders, his body breaking beneath the light. Blood filled his mouth, his lungs burned, his vision darkened. Yet he refused to fall. He bore the annihilation itself, carrying its weight as he had carried chains, fire, judgment, reflection, and beast. His spark trembled, faint as breath but unyielding. The circle faltered. Its light stuttered, uncertain. Where brilliance had been devoured, endurance unsettled it. The pale radiance dimmed, retreating back into the grooves of stone. Silence filled the cavern, heavy and absolute. When the light faded completely, Sungyun still stood. His body swayed, broken and bloodied, but his spark hovered above him, faint yet alive. Around him, only a handful of survivors remained. The rest were gone, erased by the circle's demand. Those who endured staggered to their feet, their eyes hollow, their sparks trembling. The far wall cracked, revealing another passage into darkness. The survivors stepped forward, fewer than ever, their footsteps heavy. Sungyun lingered for a moment, his breath ragged, his body screaming. Then, with the faint glow of his spark above him, he stepped forward once more. He had not conquered the circle. He had carried it. The survivors shuffled through the next passage like shadows of themselves. Their sparks hovered dim and frail above them, casting so little light that the stone swallowed it almost entirely. The air here was still, thick, suffocating, like the lungs of the mountain had stopped breathing. No one spoke. Words had no meaning anymore. Only endurance did. The corridor sloped downward until it ended in an archway carved with patterns that seemed to twist when viewed too long. Beyond it lay a chamber vast and cavernous, its walls smooth as glass, reflecting the dim glow of sparks like warped mirrors. The floor was polished obsidian, slick and cold beneath their steps. And at the chamber's center rose an altar of white stone, stark and alien against the blackness. Upon it rested a single object, a mask of silver, its surface flawless, gleaming faintly as though it breathed. The survivors hesitated, sparks trembling. The mask radiated not heat nor cold, but a presence that pressed into their minds. It whispered in silence, a question without words. Who are you when nothing remains? One prodigy, desperate to prove themselves, strode forward. They seized the mask with trembling hands and placed it upon their face. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the chamber quaked. Their bodies stiffened, their spark blazing wildly as if torn open. They screamed as the mask fused to their skin, burning into their flesh. When the glow faded, their body crumbled to dust. Their spark was gone, fear swept through the group, but the mask did not vanish. It remained gleaming faintly, waiting. The survivors realized the truth. The mask would test them all. One by one, they approached. Some lasted mere seconds before their sparks were consumed, their bodies erased. Others endured longer, their brilliance blazing, but brilliance was not enough. Every survivor who donned the mask fell, their sparks extinguished, their names devoured. When Sungyun's turn came, his legs trembled as he stepped toward the altar. His spark flickered faintly, smaller than ever. His body ached, his chest burned, his mind whispered surrender. Yet he reached out and lifted the mask. It was heavier than stone, colder than death. He pressed it to his face. The world shattered. He was no longer in the chamber. He stood in a void, endless and dark. Before him stretched chains, infinite and unbreakable, reaching into every horizon. And bound within them was himself countless reflections. Each scarred, each broken, each whispering his failures. You are nothing, they hissed. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself. The chains tightened. His spark dimmed further, shrinking to a pinprick. Pain lanced through him, tearing at his soul, unraveling every vow he had made. His knees buckled, his chest heaved. Despair clawed at him, cold and merciless. But then he saw her. Soyeon standing just beyond the chains. Fragile, trembling, her eyes filled with trust. Her hand stretched toward him, faint but steady. If you will not open, he whispered, his voice breaking. Then I will carry you with me. The chains trembled. The reflections faltered, their whispers stuttering into silence. Sungyun staggered forward, every step agony, every breath fire. His spark trembled violently, but it did not die. He bore the chains, bore the weight of his reflections, bore the mask's suffocating demand. I am weak, he gasped, blood spilling from his lips. But I will not fall. I will carry. The void quaked. The chains splintered, light spilling from their cracks. One by one, the reflections dissolved into dust. The mask's grip faltered, its whispers fading into silence. When Sungyun opened his eyes, he was back in the chamber. The mask lay shattered on the altar, fragments of silver scattered across the stone. His body shook violently, his spark faint as breath, but alive. Around him, only a handful of survivors remained. The rest were gone, consumed by the mask's trial. The cavern was silent, save for their ragged breaths. The far wall split open, stone grinding to reveal another passage. Sungyun staggered to his feet, his vow burning within him like a brand. He had not conquered the mask. He had carried it, and once more he stepped into the dark. The corridor that opened from the chamber of the shattered mask was longer than any before. Its walls were smooth, unnaturally so, as though carved not by hands but by the will of something vast. No sound echoed here. Even their footsteps felt muted, swallowed into the silence. The survivors walked slowly, sparks faint and trembling, each step heavier than the last dot at last. The tunnel widened into a cavern immense and circular, its ceiling vanishing into darkness. In the center rose a monolith of black stone, towering, its surface etched with runes that pulsed faintly with pale fire. Chains stretched from the monolith to the cavern walls, taut and humming with unseen energy. The air vibrated with it, pressing against skin and bone. The survivors froze, sparks flickering uneasily. The monolith pulsed once and the chains snapped taut. A sound like thunder filled the cavern as the ground split open. From the cracks emerged figures, hulking constructs of stone and iron, their eyes hollow pits of fire. They moved with dreadful slowness, yet every step shook the ground. Panic surged. Sparks flared as survivors struck desperately. Lightning carved arcs through the air. Fire seared. blades clanged against iron flesh. The cavern erupted into chaos, brilliance shattering the silence. But the constructs did not falter. For everyone shattered. Another rose from the cracks, pulled upward by chains that seemed endless. Sungyeon stumbled back, his spark trembling faintly above him. Fear clawed at him. This was not a trial of judgment or reflection. This was war, endless and merciless. His body screamed to collapse, but he clenched his fists. He remembered the vow, "I will carry," he whispered. A construct loomed over him, chains whipping. He braced himself, bowing his shoulders as the impact struck. Pain tore through his chest, his vision blurred, blood filled his mouth. His spark dimmed violently, shrinking to a thread. But he did not fall. He endured. The constructs pressed closer, each step heavier, each chain hungrier. Survivors fell one by one, their sparks extinguished, their bodies broken. Some screamed defiantly, others wept as they were dragged into the cracks. The cavern became a graveyard of brilliance, sparks winking out like stars consumed by night. Sungyeon staggered forward, his body breaking with every step. He did not strike. He bore the chains as they coiled around him, dragging him to his knees. His spark trembled, nearly gone. Then, from within the monolith, a voice echoed. Not in sound, but in thought. "You cannot carry this. You will break." His lips bled as he whispered back, "Then I will break carrying it." The chains shuddered. The monolith's glow faltered, uncertain. Sungyeon's spark steadied, faint but unyielding. The constructs froze mid-step, their fire eyes dimming. Slowly, they collapsed back into the cracks, dragged down by chains. Silence fell, broken only by the survivors' ragged breaths. Only a handful remained now, their sparks weak, their bodies shattered. They stood in silence, staring at the monolith with fear and awe. Sungyeon collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving. His spark flickered faintly above him, trembling but alive. The monolith pulsed once more, its runes dimming. The chains slackened, retreating into the stone. The far wall split open, revealing another passage into the darkness. Sungyeon forced himself upright. His vow burned within him like a brand, heavier than ever. He had not conquered the constructs. He had carried them. The survivors stepped into the next passage like ghosts dragged forward by duty. Their sparks hovered faintly, fragile as dying embers, and the air around them seemed to press heavier with every step. The silence here was different, denser, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. The tunnel twisted sharply before opening into a chamber vast and terrible. Its floor was a mosaic of shattered mirrors, each shard reflecting not only the survivors' forms but warped images of their sparks. The walls curved upward, lined with countless chains that hung like vines, their ends vanishing into the darkness above. At the center stood a dais of black stone, circular, its surface polished smooth as glass. The survivors froze at the threshold. Their sparks quivered, uneasy, as the air grew colder. Then the mirrors trembled. Reflections twisted, shuddered, and stepped out. Figures emerged from the shards, not perfect doubles like the river's reflections, but distorted mockeries. Some bore hollow eyes, others gaping mouths filled with silent screams. Their sparks flickered like dying flames, yet their movements were sharp, merciless. The chamber erupted in chaos. Survivors cried out as their twisted shadows lunged, chains snapping from the walls to coil around limbs and throats. Sparks flared desperately, lightning cracked, fire roared. Blades flashed, but for every shadow destroyed, another rose from the mirrors. Sungyeon staggered back as his own shadow emerged. It looked like him, but broken, its body hunched, its spark barely visible, its face twisted with scorn. It whispered without sound, "You are weak. You cannot carry her. You are already failing." The shadow struck. Sungyeon fell beneath its weight, shards cutting into his skin. His spark flickered violently, shrinking until it was nearly gone. Pain roared through him, despair clawing at his heart. He remembered the river, the mask, the judges, every time he had been told he was nothing. And perhaps here, surrounded by twisted truths, that was all he was. But then he thought of Soyeon. Her fragile smile, her trembling hand, her quiet trust. She had believed in him, not because he was brilliant, but because he endured. "I will carry you too," he whispered hoarsely. The shadow faltered. Its scorn twisted into uncertainty. Sungyeon pushed himself upright, every muscle screaming, every breath fire. His spark trembled violently, but it did not die. He stepped forward, arms outstretched, and grasped his shadow. It writhed, tearing at him, searing his flesh. Yet he held on. The shadow dissolved into light, sinking into his chest. For a moment he felt heavier, his body bowed beneath the weight of his failures. But the weight was honest. It was his dot around him. Survivors fell one by one, dragged screaming into the mirrors. Their sparks wink out, their bodies vanishing. Only a handful remained when the last shadow dissolved, silence falling once more. The dais cracked, chains snapping free as the far wall split open. The survivors stagger toward it, their sparks faint, their bodies broken. Sungyun collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, blood dripping from his lips. His spark flickered faintly above him, trembling but steady. He had not conquered the shadows. He had carried them, and once more he rose, stepping into the darkness. The survivors trudged deeper into the mountain, their steps dragging as though each stride carried the weight of an entire world. Sparks flickered weakly above them, faint lanterns in a sea of shadow. The silence was suffocating, heavy with the absence of hope. They were fewer now, too few, and the thought lingered in every mind that the mountain would swallow even this remnant whole. The corridor widened suddenly, spilling them into a cavern vast and round, its ceiling bristling with stalactites like the teeth of a colossal maw. The floor was smooth, carved into concentric circles that led toward a central platform. Upon it rested a throne wrought of bone and chain, pale and grotesque. Seated there was no statue, no construct, but a figure cloaked in shadow. Its head was bowed, its face unseen, its spark hidden deep within. The survivors froze. Even their sparks dimmed further, as though cowed by the figure's presence. For a long, terrible moment, nothing stirred. Then the figure raised its head. Eyes like dying stars burned in the void of its face. Chains slithered from the throne, rattling as they spread across the floor, encircling the survivors in a ring of iron. The cavern pulsed with power, a rhythm that pressed into their bones. The figure spoke, not with a voice, but with thought that cut through their minds like blades. "You who endure, show me." The chains lashed forward. Survivors screamed as they were dragged into the air, sparks flickering violently. Some struck back desperately, fire blazing, lightning cracking, but the chains devoured their brilliance, feeding it back into the throne. One by one, sparks winked out, bodies crumbling to ash. Sungyun staggered as chains whipped toward him. He raised his arms, not to strike, but to shield. The impact hurled him across the floor, blood spilling from his lips. His spark trembled faintly, smaller than ever. The shadowed figure rose from the throne, towering, its presence crushing. It was no beast, no reflection. It was wool-made flesh, the trial itself. Despair gnawed at him. How could he bear this? His body was broken, his spark a fragile ember. Around him, survivors fell, their sparks extinguished, their vows forgotten. The figure's voice cut through him. You are nothing. You cannot carry this weight. You cannot even carry yourself. Sungyun's knees buckled. Chains coiled around him, pressing into his flesh, crushing his chest. His vision darkened, his spark dimmed until it was a breath from vanishing, but within the darkness, he saw her again. Soyun fragile, trembling, her hand warm in his. He remembered the day she had opened her eyes, her faint smile, her quiet trust. She had believed in him when no one else had. His lips trembled, blood staining his teeth. If you will not open... His voice cracked, but he forced the words out. Then I will carry you with me. The chains tightened, searing his skin. Pain roared through him. His spark dimmed but did not die. He bowed his shoulders, bearing the weight as he had borne every trial before. The figure faltered. Its star eyes flickered, uncertain. The chains trembled, their rhythm breaking. Sungyun's spark, faint but steady, shone against the crushing dark. The cavern shook. The throne cracked. With a sound like worlds breaking, the figure dissolved into dust, its chains collapsing lifelessly onto the stone. Silence fell once more, heavy but broken. Only a handful of survivors remained, their sparks faint, their bodies scarred. They stood trembling, hollow-eyed, staring at the shattered throne. Sungyun collapsed to his knees, blood dripping from his lips, his body shaking violently. His spark hovered above him, fragile but unbroken. He had not conquered the figure. He had carried it. The far wall split open, stone grinding as another passage revealed itself. The survivors stepped forward in silence, their footsteps heavy with the weight of all they had endured. Sungyun rose slowly, his vow burning within him, heavier than ever. And once more, he walked into the darkness. The passage beyond the shattered throne wound downward in silence. The survivors walked like specters, their sparks dim and trembling, the faint light barely enough to touch the stone around them. Their breaths came ragged, each step dragging as though the weight of the mountain itself pressed against their backs. The air grew colder, sharper, carrying with it a taste of iron and ash. At last, the The corridor opened into a cavern vast and jagged, its floor cracked into deep fissures. From those fissures rose heat, faint but constant, carrying with it whispers, not of words but of despair. The chamber pulsed with that despair, heavy and suffocating, pressing into skin and soul alike. At the center of the cavern stood a spire of black stone taller than any man. Chains wrapped it in spirals, their links glowing faintly red as if heated from within. At the spire's peak hovered a sphere of pale light, its glow trembling as though caught between life and death. The survivors froze at the threshold. Their sparks flickered violently, uneasy beneath the spire's glow. Then, without warning, the fissures split wider. From the cracks rose figures, not beasts, not reflections, but wraiths. Their forms were smoke and ash, their faces hollow voids, their sparks twisted into pale imitations. They moved with eerie silence, gliding rather than walking, their chains dragging along the ground. The survivors cried out as the wraiths descended. Lightning flashed, fire roared, blades struck, but the wraiths did not fall. Their bodies dissolved into smoke, reforming behind their prey. Chains lashed out, seizing arms and throats, pulling sparks from trembling bodies. One survivor screamed as their spark was torn from their chest, devoured by a wraith's hollow maw. Another collapsed silently, their light extinguished in an instant. The cavern became a storm of despair. Every strike, every desperate cry was swallowed into the void. Sungyun staggered as a wraith lunged at him. Its hollow face pressed close, its chain coiling around his chest. He gasped as his spark flickered violently, shrinking to a fragile ember. The whispers filled his ears. You are weak. You cannot carry her. You will fail her, as you fail yourself. His knees buckled. His body screamed to collapse. For a heartbeat, he wanted to let go, to let the darkness devour him and end the weight he bore. But then he remembered Soyeon's hand, trembling yet warm. He remembered her faint smile, her quiet trust. He remembered the vow he had whispered when no one else had listened. If you will not open, then I will carry you with me. His fists clenched. His breath came ragged. Slowly, painfully, he lifted his head to meet the hollow void of the wraith's face. I will carry you too, he whispered, voice raw but steady. The wraith shuddered. Its chain trembled, its hollow maw faltering. Sungyun bowed his shoulders, enduring the weight, letting the despair press into him. His spark dimmed to a thread, trembling, but it did not die. The wraith dissolved into smoke, collapsing into the fissures below. The others faltered as well, their forms shuddering before dissipating into ash. The cavern stilled, silence returning heavy and cold. Only a handful of survivors remained, their sparks faint, their bodies broken. They stood trembling, their eyes hollow, their breaths shallow. Sungyun collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, blood staining his lips. His spark flickered faintly above him, smaller than ever, but alive. He had not conquered the wraiths. He had carried them. The spire pulsed once, its light dimming. The chains around it loosened, clattering lifelessly to the ground. The far wall split open, revealing another passage into the mountain's depths. Sungyun rose slowly, his vow burning within him, heavier than ever. And once more, he stepped into the darkness. The passage narrowed into a jagged corridor where the walls glistened with moisture, reflecting faint sparks like broken shards of glass. Every breath carried the chill of stone long untouched by warmth. The survivors moved slowly, their steps hesitant, as though each stride pressed them deeper into a grave that had no end. After what felt like hours, the corridor widened, revealing a cavern vast and silent. Its floor was polished black stone, smooth as a mirror, reflecting the survivors' faint sparks above their heads. The chamber was circular, symmetrical, too perfect to be natural. At its center stood a pedestal of pale stone, upon which rested a sword. It was unlike any weapon they had seen. Its blade shimmered like starlight, yet chains coiled along its length, binding it tightly. The sparks reflected in the sword's surface trembled, distorted. As though warning of its hunger, the survivors froze at the threshold. None dared step forward, but the sword pulsed faintly, its light beckoning, demanding. One survivor broke the silence, a boy with fire blazing in his eyes. This trial is mine, he said, and strode toward the pedestal. His spark flared bright, flames gathering in his palms. He reached for the sword. The moment his hand touched the hilt, the chains came alive. They snapped outward with a shriek of metal, coiling around his arms, his chest, his throat. He screamed as his spark was dragged from him, devoured into the blade. His body collapsed, lifeless, as the sword pulsed brighter. Terror rippled through the group. But the sword's demand was relentless. One by one, survivors were drawn toward it, some by pride, others by desperation. Each time, the result was the same. Chains lashed, sparks were devoured, the sword shone brighter. Sungyeon lingered at the edge of the chamber, his spark faint and trembling. His chest tightened as he watched the sword consume brilliance after brilliance. He knew he had no power to claim it. But he also knew he could not turn away. His steps were slow, heavy, but he moved forward. The pedestal loomed before him, the sword pulsing faintly, its chains rattling as though eager. He reached out, his hand trembling, and grasped the hilt. The chains struck instantly, coiling around him, searing his flesh. Pain roared through his body as his spark trembled violently, shrinking to a fragile ember. The sword's voice whispered in his mind, cold and merciless. "You are nothing. You cannot carry her. You cannot carry me." Blood filled his mouth. His knees buckled. The chains tightened, threatening to crush his chest and rip his spark away. But he remembered Soyun's fragile smile, her trembling hand, her quiet trust. He remembered the vow he had whispered when no one else had. "If you will not open, then I will carry you with me. I will carry you too," he gasped, his voice breaking. The sword shuddered. The chains trembled. For a moment, the weight grew unbearable, searing through his flesh, burning into his bones. His spark dimmed to a thread, smaller than ever. But it did not die. The chains loosened, retreating slowly. The sword's light flickered, uncertain. Then, with a final pulse, it dimmed, its brilliance swallowed into silence. The chains clattered lifelessly to the floor. Sungyeon collapsed to his knees, the sword still in his grip. His chest heaved, his body broken, his spark faint above him. He had not conquered the sword. He had carried its hunger. The pedestal cracked, splitting apart. The chamber groaned as the far wall opened, revealing another passage into the dark. Sungyeon staggered to his feet, the sword still in his trembling hand. He had no strength to wield it, but he bore it all the same. And once more, with his spark faint but unyielding, he stepped forward into the darkness. The corridor beyond the chamber of the chained sword stretched long and silent, as though carved into the bones of the mountain itself. The air was colder now, biting against skin, every breath laced with frost. Sparks hovered faintly above the survivors' heads, their glow too weak to chase away the oppressive dark. They moved in silence. Each step echoed too loudly, and every echo carried a weight of dread. The sword Sungyeon bore felt heavier with each stride, not in steel, but in spirit, as if the blade remembered every spark it had devoured and pressed that hunger into his flesh. His grip trembled, his arms ached, but he did not let go. At last, the corridor widened, spilling them into a cavern vast and terrible. The ceiling stretched upward into shadow, unseen. The ground was carved into spirals, leading toward a pit at the center. From that pit rose cold mist, thick and pale, coiling into the chamber like the breath of something sleeping far below. The spirals glowed faintly with runes, their light pulsing in rhythm with the mist. The survivors froze at the threshold. Their sparks flickered violently, uneasy beneath the weight of the chamber. Then the pit stirred. From the mist rose figures, tall, gaunt, cloaked in darkness. Their faces were masks of bone, their eyes pits of pale fire. Chains coiled around their limbs, dragging along the stone as they stepped forward. The wraiths moved without sound, their presence heavier than any roar. The survivors cried out, sparks flaring desperately. Lightning split the dark. Flames seared the mist. Blades clashed against bone. But the wraiths did not falter. Every strike passed through them like smoke. Every flame was swallowed into the mist. Sungyeon's grip tightened on the sword. He raised it, trembling, and swung. The blade cut through a wraith, but instead of falling, it screamed, a soundless cry that tore through his mind. Pain lanced his skull, his spark flickering violently. He staggered, blood dripping from his nose, his chest heaving. The sword was no weapon against them. The wraith lunged, its chain coiling around his throat. His spark trembled violently, shrinking to a fragile ember. The whispers filled his mind, "You are nothing. You cannot carry her. You cannot carry yourself." His knees buckled. His body screamed to collapse. He wanted to let go, to let the mist swallow him, to end the torment. But then he remembered Soyun, her eyes opening, fragile but real, her smile faint yet steady. He remembered the vow, "If you will not open, then I will carry you with me." His arms shook violently, but he lifted the sword once more. Not to strike, not to conquer, but to endure. He bowed his shoulders, bearing the weight as the chain tightened around his throat. His spark dimmed, smaller than ever. Yet it held. The wraith faltered. Its pale fire flickered, uncertain. The mist recoiled, shuddering. One by one, the wraiths dissolved into smoke, their chains clattering lifelessly onto the stone. The pit groaned, its mist sinking back into darkness. Silence returned, broken only by ragged breaths. Only a handful of survivors remained, their sparks trembling weakly. They stared at Sungyun, their eyes hollow with fear and awe. Sungyun collapsed to his knees, the sword trembling in his grip. His chest heaved, his body broken, his spark faint but steady. He had not conquered the wraiths. He had carried their weight until they broke. The spirals carved into the floor dimmed, their runes fading. The far wall cracked, opening into another passage. Sungyun staggered to his feet, the sword heavy in his hand, his vow heavier still. And once more he stepped into the darkness. The survivors pressed on into the next passage, their sparks faint glimmers trembling above weary heads. The silence between them had become absolute. Even whispers felt like sacrilege. Each survivor knew the truth now. Every step forward was one step closer to vanishing. They were not walking through trials, but through a graveyard where the mountain chose its dead. The corridor sloped downward, its walls slick with condensation, the air heavy with the chill of buried water. Soon the passage widened into a cavern vast and hollow, its floor flooded by a shallow lake. The water stretched outward into shadow, still as glass, reflecting sparks faintly on its surface. In the lake's center rose a platform of jagged stone, black and sharp like the spine of a beast. A narrow bridge of crumbling stone led across the water. Each step on it cracked faintly, sending ripples across the lake. The survivors hesitated, but the passage forward was clear. They had to cross. The first survivor stepped onto the bridge, sparks flickering nervously. For a moment, nothing stirred. Then the water rippled violently. Figures rose from its surface, twisted forms of drowned bodies, their eyes hollow voids filled with pale fire. Chains dragged from their wrists, vanishing into the depths. The drowned surged upward, claws scraping stone, their chains whipping across the bridge. Survivors cried out, sparks flaring as they fought back. Lightning split the air. Fire blazed across the water. Blades struck against rotting flesh. But the drowned did not fall. For everyone destroyed, another rose from the depths. Their chains dragging endlessly, Sungyun staggered as a drowned lunged at him. Its claw raked across his chest, blood spilling as his spark flickered violently. He gasped, his grip trembling on the sword that hung heavy in his hands. He swung weakly, the blade cutting through the drowned. But the creature dissolved into water, only to rise again at his back. Panic clawed at him. His spark dimmed to a fragile ember, trembling in the suffocating dark. The water whispered to him, its voice a chorus of despair. You will drown. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself. His knees buckled. His body screamed to collapse. The drowned pressed closer, their chains coiling around his arms, dragging him toward the water. The weight of it threatened to pull him under, but in the crushing dark, he remembered Soyun, her fragile hand, her faint smile, her trust. He remembered the vow. If you will not open, then I will carry you with me. Blood dripped from his lips as he whispered, I will carry you too. He bowed his shoulders, bearing the chains as they coiled tighter. His spark dimmed violently, shrinking to a thread, but it did not die. The drowned shuddered, their pale fire flickering uncertainly. The water rippled violently, the whispers faltering. One by one, the drowned dissolved into the lake, their chains sinking into the depths. The ripples stilled, leaving only silence. The survivors staggered across the bridge, fewer than ever now. Their sparks faint and trembling, Sungyun collapsed onto the jagged platform, blood staining the stone, his chest heaving. His spark hovered faintly above him, fragile but unbroken. He had not conquered the drowned. He had carried their weight until they yielded. The far wall groaned, splitting open to reveal another passage. The survivors stepped forward in silence, their footsteps heavy. Sungyun rose slowly, his sword trembling in his grip, his vow heavier than ever. And once more he stepped into the darkness. The passage that followed the drowned lake felt narrower than the ones before, though the stone had not changed. It was as if the darkness itself had grown thicker, pressing against skin and lungs. Every spark trembled faintly above the survivors, the dim glow barely enough to mark their faces. They did not speak. They had learned that words like sparks could be extinguished too easily here. The tunnel bent sharply before opening into a cavern immense and strange. Its floor was marked by concentric circles carved deep into the stone, glowing faintly with pale blue fire. The walls were lined with towering statues, warriors, judges, kings, all bound in chains, their heads bowed. At the chamber's center stood an hourglass massive, its frame wrought of iron, its glass filled not with sand but with glowing dust that shimmered like stars. The survivors froze at the threshold. The air within the cavern was heavy, vibrating faintly with a rhythm that seemed to echo their heartbeats. The hourglass pulsed once, and the dust within began to fall. Chains rattled. The statues stirred. Their heads rose slowly, eyes glowing with pale fire. With a groan of stone, they stepped down from their perches, chains dragging along the floor. Each statue carried the weight of ages, their movements slow but inexorable. The chamber quaked beneath their steps. The survivors cried out, sparks flaring desperately. Lightning split the dark, fire roared, blades struck stone. The chamber became chaos, brilliance colliding with iron. Some statues crumbled under the fury, but others pressed forward, endless, tireless. For each one destroyed, another seemed to rise from the chains that coiled along the walls. Sung-yun staggered as a statue's chain lashed across his chest, hurling him to the ground. Blood stained his lips, his spark flickering violently. His body screamed to collapse. His vision swam. The hourglass loomed above, its stardust falling steadily. With each grain, the pressure in the chamber grew heavier, crushing. The whispers began cold, merciless. You are nothing. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself. Sung-yun's chest burned. His knees buckled. His spark shrank to a fragile ember. For a moment, he wanted to surrender, to let the stardust bury him, to let the statues drag him into silence. But then he remembered Soyun. Her fragile hand in his, her faint smile, her quiet trust. He remembered the vow. If you will not open, then I will carry you with me. His fists clenched, his arms trembling as he pushed himself upright. Blood dripped from his chin, his breath ragged. He bowed his shoulders as chains lashed toward him again, bearing the weight instead of resisting. Pain roared through him, but he endured. His spark trembled violently, yet it did not die. The hourglass shuddered. The statues faltered, their chains slowing. The stardust within the glass hesitated, its fall breaking. Where brilliance had failed, endurance unsettled it. Sung-yun whispered through blood and breath, I will carry you too. The chamber quaked. One by one, the statues crumbled into dust, their chains clattering lifelessly onto the floor. The hourglass dimmed, the stardust within dissolving into nothingness. Silence fell, broken only by the survivors' ragged breaths. Only a handful remained now, their sparks faint and trembling. They stood hollow-eyed, their bodies scarred, their hope thinner than ever. Sung-yun collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, his body broken. His spark hovered faint above him, fragile but unyielding. He had not conquered the statues or the hourglass. He had carried them until they broke. The far wall split open with a groan of stone, revealing another passage. Sung-yun staggered to his feet, his sword heavy in his hand, his vow heavier still. And once more, he stepped into the darkness. The survivors stepped into the next corridor with the weight of silence pressing down on them. The air was thicker here, heavy with dust, and each spark hovering above their heads seemed dimmer than before, as though the mountain itself drank their light. They had grown so few that their footsteps no longer sounded like a company of challengers, but like the march of the condemned. The tunnel ended abruptly, spilling into a cavern vast and solemn. Its walls were covered in murals, faded, broken depictions of battles long forgotten. Heroes with blazing sparks clashed against chains and beasts, their brilliance etched into stone. Yet all of the murals ended the same way. The sparks extinguished, the heroes falling into silence. It was not a history of triumph, but a failure. At the cavern's center stood a circle of stone, wide and shallow, its floor cracked and stained with black marks as though scorched by countless battles. Around its rim were statues, faceless and broken, their hands outstretched as if mocking the living who dared to stand where so many had fallen. The survivors froze at the threshold. The circle pulsed faintly, a rhythm that pressed into their bones. Then the ground split. From the cracks emerged warriors' phantoms shaped from smoke and fire, each bearing weapons of light. Their sparks burned not above them, but within, twisted and bright, the phantoms moved without hesitation. They struck with speed and fury, their blades singing, their chains lashing. The cavern erupted in chaos as survivors cried out, sparks flaring desperately. Lightning split the dark, fire roared, steel clashed against the impossible. For every phantom destroyed, another rose from the cracks, endless, merciless. Sung-yun stumbled back, his sword trembling in his grip. His spark flickered faintly, shrinking under the weight of the storm. A phantom lunged, its blade slicing across his chest. Blood spilled, his breath caught, his knees buckled. The whispers filled his ears. You are weak. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself. He staggered, nearly collapsing. His spark dimmed violently, trembling on the edge of extinction. Around him, survivors screamed as their sparks winked out, their bodies falling lifeless. The cavern became a graveyard of light. Sungyun's chest heaved. His grip tightened on the sword. He remembered Soyun, her fragile smile, her trembling hand, her trust. He remembered the vow, if you will not open, then I will carry you with me. His lips trembled as he whispered, I will carry you too. The phantom struck again, its blade piercing deep. Pain roared through him, his body breaking. But he bowed his shoulders, enduring the weight. His spark dimmed to a fragile ember, smaller than ever. Yet it did not die, the phantom faltered. Its light flickered, its form trembling. One by one, the others followed, their brilliance stuttering, their weapons dissolving. The cavern quaked as the phantoms collapsed into dust, their sparks vanishing into the cracks. Silence returned, heavy and absolute. Only a handful of survivors remained now, fewer than ever before. Their sparks hovered faint above them, their eyes hollow. They stood trembling, staring at the broken circle. Sungyun collapsed to his knees, blood staining the stone, his breath ragged. His spark flickered faintly above him, fragile but steady. He had not conquered the phantoms. He had carried them until they fell. The murals along the walls dimmed, their faded brilliance sinking deeper into shadow. The far wall cracked open, revealing another passage into the mountain's depths. Sungyun forced himself upright, his vow heavier than ever. His body broken, his soul scarred, but still he stepped forward into the darkness. The new passage descended steeply, carved like a wound into the earth. The survivors' sparks hovered faintly above them, too dim to light more than a step ahead. Their breaths echoed in the silence, harsh and ragged like whispers of the condemned. Every step forward felt heavier than the last, as if the mountain pressed against their backs to turn them away. Yet still they walked. The tunnel ended in a cavern vast and alien. Its floor was a lattice of black stone, cracked into sharp angles, and beneath those cracks burned a faint glow, as though fire smoldered in the mountain's heart. The walls were smooth and polished, reflecting sparks in distorted shapes. At the chamber's center hovered a sphere of chains, hundreds of links woven into a globe, suspended in midair, turning slowly as if it breathed. The survivors froze at the threshold. The chains pulsed once and the sphere split apart. From its fragments emerged figures, armored warriors forged of iron and shadow, their faces hidden behind masks of flame. Each carried a weapon larger than a man, their sparks burning within like molten cores. The warriors stepped forward in unison, their chains rattling like drums of war. The cavern quaked beneath their march. The survivors cried out as the assault began. Sparks flared, desperately lightning cracked, fire roared, blades struck with fury. The cavern erupted in chaos, brilliance shattering against iron, yet the warriors did not falter. Their weapons cleaved through flame, their chains smothered lightning, their presence crushed even the strongest. For every blow landed, the warriors pressed forward twice as hard. Sungyun stumbled as a blade grazed his shoulder, blood spilling down his arm. His spark flickered violently, trembling faintly above him. Fear clawed at him. These were not beasts or shadows, but soldiers crafted for war eternal. His body screamed to collapse, but he clenched the sword in his trembling grip. A warrior struck, its chain wrapping around his chest, crushing his ribs. He gasped, his knees buckling, blood flooding his mouth. The whispers filled his ears. You are weak. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself. His spark dimmed to a fragile ember. His vision blurred. The weight was unbearable, but he remembered Soyun, her fragile smile, her trembling hand, her trust. He remembered the vow, if you will not open, then I will carry you with me. His lips cracked as he whispered, I will carry you too. He bowed his shoulders as the chain tightened, bearing its weight. Pain roared through him, tearing his flesh, crushing his chest. His spark trembled violently, nearly extinguished. Yet it did not die. The warrior faltered. Its mask of flame flickered uncertainly. The others hesitated, their chains slowing. Sungyun's spark, faint but steady, endured against them. The cavern shook. The sphere of chains collapsed inward, its fragments dissolving into ash. The warriors shuddered, their weapons falling silent, their forms crumbling into dust. Silence fell, broken only by the survivors' ragged breaths. Only a handful remained now. Their sparks faint, their bodies broken. They stood hollow-eyed, staring at Sungyun not with scorn, but with something closer to fear. He collapsed to his knees, blood staining the stone, his chest heaving. His spark hovered faintly above him, fragile but unbroken. He had not conquered the warriors. He had carried their weight until they yielded. The cracks in the floor dimmed, the smoldering glow fading. The far wall split open, revealing another passage into the darkness. Sungyun rose slowly, the sword heavy in his hand, his vow heavier still. And once more he stepped forward. The corridor beyond the cavern of chained warriors was narrower than before, its walls jagged as though torn open by claws. The air was hot, suffused with the faint stench of smoke and ash. Sparks hovered faintly above the survivors, their glow flickering against the stone, too fragile to hold back the encroaching dark. Each step echoed like a heartbeat, a reminder of how few remained. The passage ended abruptly in a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow. The floor was a cracked plain of scorched rock, its surface glowing faintly as if the fire within the mountain still lived. At the center yawned a massive chasm, wide and endless, its depths filled with roiling flame. Spanning it was a bridge of chains, taut and trembling, stretching toward another ledge far across the abyss. The survivors froze. The chains groaned, swaying faintly with the heat. Sparks flickered violently, uneasy at the sight. Yet there was no other path forward. To cross meant survival. To hesitate meant death. The first survivor stepped onto the bridge. The chains rattled, groaning under the weight. For a moment, silence held. Then the fire below roared. From the flames rose figures fiends wrought of molten iron and smoke, their eyes burning coals, their mouths gaping maws of fire. Chains coiled from their limbs, striking upward at the bridge. The fiends attacked without pause. Their chains lashed, searing hot, dragging sparks downward into the fire. Survivors cried out, their sparks blazing desperately as they struck back. Lightning split the dark, flames roared against flame, blades clashed against molten iron. But for every fiend destroyed, another rose from the abyss, endless, merciless. Sungyun staggered as a chain lashed his side, burning deep into his flesh. His spark flickered violently, trembling above him. The heat seared his lungs, his body screamed to collapse. He gripped the sword tightly, but even the weapon felt heavier than ever. As though it too wished to fall into the fire, another fiend rose before him, its chains striking like whips. He raised the sword weakly, the impact hurling him to his knees. Blood spilled from his lips, his chest heaving. The whispers filled his ears, born of fire and chain. You are nothing. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself. His vision blurred. His spark shrank to a fragile ember. He wanted to let go, to fall, to vanish into the flames, but then he remembered Soyeon. Her faint smile, her trembling hand in his. The trust that had anchored him when all else had crumbled. The vow that had carried him through trial after trial. If you will not open, then I will carry you with me. His lips cracked as he whispered, I will carry you too. The chains lashed again, striking his chest. Pain roared through him, his spark flickering violently. Yet he bowed his shoulders, bearing the weight instead of resisting. His body broke further, but his spark endured. The fiend faltered, its fire stuttering. The chains around him trembled, uncertain. One by one, the others followed, their flames flickering before dissolving into smoke. The chasm roared once more, then stilled, the fire sinking deeper into silence. The survivors staggered across the bridge, fewer than ever now, their sparks dim and trembling. Every step rattled the chains, but no fiends rose again. Sungyun collapsed upon the far ledge, his chest scorched, his body broken. His spark hovered faintly above him, fragile but alive. He had not conquered the fiends of flame. He had carried their weight until they yielded behind him. The bridge of chains groaned and fell apart, plunging into the abyss below. The far wall cracked open, revealing another passage into darkness. Sungyun rose slowly, the sword heavy in his hand, his vow heavier still. And once more he stepped forward into the night. The survivors entered the next corridor in silence, their sparks faint and fragile, little more than embers clinging stubbornly to the dark. The air here was colder, not with the damp chill of stone, but with something emptier, hollow like the absence of life itself. The walls narrowed until the path felt more like a vein carved through the heart of a corpse than a passage in the mountain. At last, the tunnel widened into a chamber vast and terrible. The floor was smooth, polished obsidian, its surface so flawless it reflected sparks above like distorted stars. The walls were lined with towering mirrors, tall and narrow, each framed by chains. The glass was dark, but within it faint shapes stirred, waiting. The survivors froze at the threshold. Their sparks flickered uneasily. Then the mirrors shivered, From the glass stepped reflections, not twisted parodies as before, but perfect doubles. Each survivor faced themselves. The same body, the same spark, the same weight in their eyes. The reflections moved with precision, raising their weapons in unison. No scream, no whisper, only silent inevitability. The chamber erupted in chaos. Sparks clashed against sparks as survivors struck at their doubles. Every blow landed was mirrored. Every wound inflicted returned. It was not a battle against monsters, but against themselves. Against everything they were, Seonjin's reflection stood before him. Its spark faint, its shoulders bowed, its sword trembling. It looked exactly as he did. Weary, broken, on the edge of collapse. For a moment, he could not raise his weapon. To strike meant to admit the truth that this weakness was him, and there was no escaping it. The reflection attacked. Their swords clashed, sparks trembling violently above them. Pain tore through his arm as the blade cut deep. His reflection bled in the same place, yet its eyes did not falter. The whispers rose not from the mirrors, not from the chains, but from within. You are nothing. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself. His knees buckled, his chest heaved, his spark dimmed to a fragile ember. He wanted to surrender, to let the reflection cut him down, to let the truth consume him. But then he remembered Soyeon, her fragile hand, her faint smile, her quiet trust. He remembered the vow. If you will not open, then I will carry you with me. His lips trembled, blood spilling as he whispered, I will carry you too. The reflection faltered. Its blade wavered, its spark flickering. Seonjin stepped forward, his body broken, his breath ragged. He bowed his shoulders, enduring the weight of his own weakness. His spark trembled violently, yet it did not die. The reflection lowered its weapon. Its form dissolved into smoke, its spark sinking into his. One by one, the others followed, their doubles collapsing into silence as survivors bore them or were consumed by them. When the last reflection faded, only a handful remained. Their sparks hovered faintly, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. The mirrors along the walls cracked, shattering into fragments that clattered lifelessly onto the obsidian floor. Seonjin collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, his sword trembling in his grip. His spark hovered faintly above him, fragile but alive. He had not conquered himself. He had carried his reflection until it yielded. The far wall split open, revealing another passage into darkness. Seonjin rose slowly, his vow burning heavier than ever. And once more he stepped into the night. The survivors moved into the next passage like shadows barely clinging to form. Their sparks hovered faintly, trembling as though a breath could extinguish them. The corridor wound upward in jagged spirals, each turned tighter than the last, the air thinner, sharper. It felt less like a path carved by hands and more like the throat of some ancient beast, swallowing them whole. At last, the spiral opened into a cavern vast and hollow. Its floor was uneven, cracked like dry earth, and from the fissures seeped faint light, pale and sickly. At the chamber's center stood a pillar of white stone, smooth and unmarked, rising high toward the ceiling. Around it lay countless weapons, blades, spears, shields scattered and broken, their edges dulled by time. Sparks flickered faintly within the shattered steel, remnants of those who had once carried them. The survivors froze at the threshold. The pillar pulsed faintly, and the weapons stirred. From the broken steel rose figures, knights wrought of shattered armor and splintered blades, their bodies pieced together from fragments of the fallen. Their sparks burned within cracked helms, pale and unstable, but their steps were steady. Their chains rattling against the ground. The knights advanced. Their broken weapons swung with unnatural strength, their shields absorbing strikes that should have shattered them. Survivors cried out, sparks flaring desperately. Lightning carved across the cavern, fire blazed, steel rang against steel. But the knights pressed forward relentlessly, their broken forms refusing to fall. For everyone shattered, two more rose from the remnants. Seonjin stumbled back as a knight's blade slashed his arm, blood spraying across the cracked stone. His spark flickered violently, trembling above him. His body ached, his chest burned, his sword felt heavier than ever. The knights closed in, their chains whipping, their sparks flaring like dying stars. The whispers began, cold and merciless. You are nothing. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself. His knees buckled. His vision blurred. His spark dimmed to a fragile ember. Around him, survivors fell one by one, their sparks extinguished, their bodies crumbling into the cracks. The cavern became a graveyard of echoes. But Seonjin remembered Soyeon, her trembling hand, her faint smile, her quiet trust. He remembered the vow. If you will not open, then I will carry you with me. His lips bled as he whispered, I will carry you too. He bowed his shoulders as the knights struck again, blades tearing into his flesh. Pain roared through him, his body screaming to collapse. His spark flickered violently, shrinking smaller than ever. Yet it did not die. The knights faltered. Their broken forms shuddered, their sparks flickering uncertainly. One by one, they collapsed into piles of shattered steel, their chains clattering lifelessly onto the ground. The pillar of white stone dimmed, its glow fading into silence. Only a handful of survivors remained now, their sparks faint, their bodies scarred. They stood hollow-eyed, trembling, staring at the ruin of the knights. Sungyun collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, blood dripping onto the cracked stone. His spark hovered faintly above him, fragile, but alive. He had not conquered the broken knights. He had carried their weight until they yielded. The far wall split open, revealing another passage. Sungyun rose slowly, his vow heavier than ever, his sword trembling in his grip. And once more he stepped into the darkness. The survivors entered the next corridor like phantoms barely clinging to existence. Their sparks hovered faintly above them, trembling embers that offered no warmth. The air was sharp, metallic, carrying the stench of rust and old blood. The walls of the tunnel were lined with scratches, deep grooves as though countless hands had clawed at the stone in desperation. The passage ended in a cavern vast and circular. Its walls curved upward into shadow, and from the ceiling hung chains in uncountable numbers. They dangled silently, swaying in an unseen wind, each tipped with a hook or shackle. The floor was bare stone, cracked and uneven, stained dark by the remnants of those who had come before. The survivors froze. Their sparks flickered violently, unease clawing at them. Then the chains stirred. They fell like rain. Hooks snapped around wrists, ankles, throats. Survivors screamed as they were yanked upward, sparks flaring desperately. Lightning flashed, fire roared, blades struck, but the chains were endless. For every one severed, 3 more descended from the ceiling. Sungyun staggered as chains coiled around his chest, crushing his ribs. He gasped, blood spilling from his mouth, his spark trembling faintly. He swung the sword weakly, severing one link, but 2 more coiled tighter. His knees buckled, his breath caught. The whispers rose from the chains themselves. You are nothing. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself. His vision blurred. His spark dimmed to a fragile ember. The weight of the chains threatened to break him apart, to drag him upward into the dark. For a heartbeat, he wanted to let go, to surrender, to vanish, to end the torment. But then he remembered Soyeon. Her fragile hand, her faint smile, her quiet trust. He remembered the vow he had whispered when no one else had listened. If you will not open, then I will carry you with me. His lips bled as he whispered, I will carry you too. The chains tightened, tearing into his flesh, but he bowed his shoulders and bore them. His body screamed, his spark trembled violently, shrinking to a thread. Yet it did not die. The chamber quaked. The chains faltered, their rhythm breaking. One by one, they recoiled into the ceiling, snapping lifelessly against the stone. Survivors collapsed to the floor, gasping. Their sparks faint but alive. Only a handful remained now, fewer than ever, their eyes hollow, their bodies scarred. They stared upward at the endless chains, fear etched into their faces. Sungyun fell to his knees, his chest heaving, blood dripping onto the cracked stone. His spark hovered faintly above him, fragile but steady. He had not conquered the chains. He had carried their weight until they yielded. The far wall cracked open with a groan of stone, revealing another passage into the mountain's depths. Sungyun forced himself upright, his sword trembling in his hand, his vow burning heavier than ever. And once more he stepped into the darkness. The corridor that followed the chamber of chains was narrow, its walls pressing close like the ribs of a dying beast. The air was stagnant, carrying with it the sour stench of decay. Sparks hovered faintly above the survivors, so dim now that their glow barely touched the stone. Their footsteps dragged, each stride slower than the last, as though the mountain itself sought to hold them back. At last, the corridor widened into a cavern immense and hollow. Its floor was littered with bones, human, beast, and unrecognizable things fused into grotesque shapes. The walls were etched with claw marks, deep grooves carved by desperate hands. At the chamber's center loomed a pit, wide and bottomless, its depths swallowing even the faint light of sparks. Around its rim crouched statues of beasts, their jaws open, their fangs bared, as if waiting to devour those who dared approach. The survivors froze at the threshold. The pit exhaled, a gust of air colder than death. Then the statues moved. They rose slowly, stone grinding against stone, their forms massive and bestial. Wings of broken rock spread wide, claws scraped across the floor, and from their mouths poured roars that shook the cavern. Chains clattered from their bodies as they lunged forward, their sparks burning like sickly flames within their stone eyes. The survivors cried out, sparks flaring desperately. Lightning tore through the dark, flames roared, blades clanged against rock. But the beasts were relentless, their stone bodies shrugging off every strike. One survivor was seized in a claw, crushed in an instant. Another was dragged screaming into the pit, their spark vanishing into the abyss. Seung Hyun staggered as a beast's wing struck him, hurling him across the chamber. He crashed into the bone-strewn floor, blood spilling from his lips, his spark trembling violently. His chest burned, his body screamed to collapse. The whispers rose from the pit, cold and merciless. You are nothing. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself. His vision blurred. His spark shrank to a fragile ember. The beasts closed in, their roars shaking the stone, their chains rattling like drums of doom. For a heartbeat, he wanted to let go, to surrender, to fall into the pit, to end it all. But then he remembered Soyeon, her fragile hand, her faint smile, her quiet trust. He remembered the vow. If you will not open, then I will carry you with me. His lips cracked as he whispered, I will carry you too. He rose slowly, bowing his shoulders beneath the weight of the beast's fury. Their chains lashed around him, their claws tore into his flesh, but he endured. His spark flickered violently, trembling on the edge of death. Yet it did not die. The beasts faltered. Their stone eyes dimmed, their roars weakened. One by one they crumbled into rubble, their chains clattering lifelessly onto the floor. The pit roared once, a final breath of despair, before falling silent. Only a handful of survivors remained now, their sparks faint and trembling. They stood among bones and dust, hollow-eyed, broken. Seung-yun collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, blood staining the bone-strewn floor. His spark hovered faintly above him, fragile but steady. He had not conquered the beasts. He had carried their weight until they yielded. The far wall cracked open, revealing another passage into the darkness. Seung-yun rose slowly, his sword heavy in his hand, his vow heavier still. And once more he stepped forward. The survivors walked into the next corridor like shadows clinging to existence. Their sparks hovered faintly, trembling above weary heads, their light too dim to reach the jagged walls. The air grew colder with every step, heavy with the scent of stone and iron. It felt as though the mountain itself was watching, waiting for the last of them to fall. The corridor bent sharply before opening into a cavern immense and circular. Its walls were lined with colossal pillars carved into the shapes of chained figures, giants with hollow eyes and broken mouths. From their stone chests jutted iron spikes, each pulsing faintly with a pale light. At the chamber's center stood a massive anvil of black steel, its surface cracked and scorched. As though it had been used to forge chains for eternity, the survivors froze at the threshold. Sparks flickered violently, unease spreading through the group. Then the anvil pulsed once and the pillars stirred. The giants tore themselves free of the stone, chains clattering as they stepped forward. Their forms were grotesque, half statue, half flesh, their sparks burning faintly within their hollow chests. Each carried a hammer larger than a man, its head glowing faintly with fire. The ground shook with their march. Survivors cried out, sparks blazing desperately. Lightning split the air, flames roared, blades struck against stone and iron. But the giants swung their hammers with crushing weight, shattering the cavern with each blow. One survivor was flattened beneath a strike, their spark extinguished in an instant. Another was hurled into a pillar, bones breaking, their spark winking out. Seung-yun staggered as a hammer struck near him, the shockwave hurling him across the floor. He landed hard, blood spilling from his lips, his spark flickering violently. His chest burned, his vision blurred. The whispers rose from the chains rattling around the giants. You are nothing. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself. His knees buckled. His grip on the sword faltered. His spark dimmed to a fragile ember. The weight of the giant's fury pressed against him like the mountain itself. But then he remembered Soyeon, her trembling hand, her faint smile, her quiet trust. He remembered the vow he had whispered when no one else had listened. If you will not open, then I will carry you with me. His lips bled as he whispered, I will carry you too. A hammer struck. Chains coiled, searing pain tearing through his body. But he bowed his shoulders and bore it. His spark flickered violently, smaller than ever, trembling, but it did not die. The giants faltered. Their hollow eyes dimmed, their chains trembling. One by one their forms cracked, splintered, and collapsed into rubble, their sparks extinguished in silence. The anvil pulsed once more, then shattered, fragments scattering across the floor. Only a handful of survivors remained, their sparks faint, their bodies scarred. They stood among the ruins, hollow-eyed, trembling. Sungyun collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, his blood staining the broken stone. His spark hovered faintly above him, fragile but steady. He had not conquered the giants. He had carried their weight until they yielded. The far wall split open, stone groaning as another passage revealed itself. Sungyun forced himself upright, his sword heavy in his grip, his vow burning heavier than ever. And once more he stepped forward into the darkness. The survivors entered the new passage with the silence of those who had nothing left to give. Their sparks hovered faintly, trembling like dying embers, barely keeping the dark at bay. The air pressed heavier with each step, thick and suffocating, as though the mountain itself sought to smother the last of their light. The corridor sloped downward, its walls slick with condensation, the stone glistening like sweat. Soon it opened into a cavern vast and oppressive. The floor was a wide expanse of ash, soft beneath their feet, as though countless bodies had burned here and left only dust behind. At the far end rose a gate of black iron, towering, its surface engraved with runes that pulsed faintly with pale fire. But before the gate, scattered across the field of ash, stood figures, knights clad in blackened armor, their visors glowing faintly with sparks twisted into pale embers. Each carried a blade dulled by time, yet their stance was unwavering, their presence suffocating. The survivors froze at the threshold. Sparks flickered uneasily. Then, without a word, the knights advanced. The ground shook with their march. Chains dragged from their armor, rattling like drums of doom. Survivors cried out, sparks flaring desperately. Lightning cracked. Flames roared. Steel clashed against steel. The cavern became a battlefield, brilliance colliding with shadow. The knights fought with precision, their strikes measured and merciless. For every blow landed against them, they answered with two. One survivor's chest was pierced clean through, their spark extinguished instantly. Another was dragged into the ash, their body vanishing beneath the dust. The field became a graveyard of light. Sungyun staggered as a knight's blade slashed across his chest, blood spilling down his torn clothes. His spark flickered violently, trembling faintly above him. His arms shook, his sword felt heavier than ever. The whispers rose from the knights themselves, carried by the chains that rattled with each step. You are nothing. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself. His knees buckled. His vision blurred. His spark dimmed to a fragile ember. Around him, survivors screamed, their sparks winking out one by one. The ash swallowed their cries, leaving only silence, but then he remembered So-Yun, her trembling hand, her faint smile, her quiet trust. He remembered the vow, if you will not open, then I will carry you with me. His lips cracked as he whispered, I will carry you too. A knight's blade struck again, tearing into his flesh. Pain roared through him, his body broken, his breath ragged. But he bowed his shoulders, bearing the weight instead of resisting. His spark trembled violently, yet it did not die. The knights faltered. Their visors dimmed, their sparks flickering uncertainly. One by one their blades lowered, their armor cracking, their forms collapsing into ash. The field grew still once more, the silence heavy and final. Only a handful of survivors remained, their sparks faint and trembling, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. They stood upon the field of ash, staring at the black gate. Sungyun collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, blood dripping onto the dust. His spark hovered faintly above him, fragile but unbroken. He had not conquered the knights. He had carried their weight until they yielded. The iron gate groaned, its runes dimming. With a shudder, it split open, revealing another passage into the mountain's depths. Sungyun rose slowly, his sword trembling in his grip, his vow burning heavier than ever. And once more, he stepped into the darkness. The survivors passed through the black gate in silence, their sparks faint above them, trembling as if a single breath could extinguish them. The corridor beyond was colder than any before, the air sharp and metallic, tasting of iron and frost. Every step echoed like a tolling bell, hollow and heavy. The tunnel widened into a cavern immense and foreboding. Its walls were lined with frozen waterfalls, their icicles sharp as spears, gleaming faintly in the light of sparks. The floor was slick with frost, etched with runes that pulsed with pale blue light. At the chamber's center stood a throne of ice, vast and jagged as though carved from a glacier's heart. Upon it sat a figure cloaked in frost, its body draped in chains, its eyes glowing cold fire. The survivors froze at the threshold. Their sparks flickered violently, uneasy beneath the figure's gaze. For a long, terrible moment, the chamber was silent. Then the figure raised its arm and the chains lashed outward. The battle erupted instantly. Chains struck with the speed of lightning, freezing everything they touched. Survivors cried out as sparks flared desperately. Fire roared, lightning cracked, blades shattered against frost. But the throne's guardian did not falter. Every strike was swallowed by its chains. Every flame smothered by ice. One survivor was seized mid-stride, their body encased in ice before their spark shattered within. Another was dragged screaming across the frozen floor, vanishing into the chains that coiled like serpents. The cavern filled with the sound of shattering ice and dying sparks. Sungyun staggered as a chain lashed across his chest, burning cold searing into his flesh. His spark flickered violently, trembling faintly above him. His sword slipped in his trembling hand, the frost biting into his bones. The whispers filled his ears. "You are nothing. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself." His knees buckled. His breath fogged in the freezing air. His spark shrank to a fragile ember. Around him, survivors fell, their sparks extinguished one by one. The throne loomed above, the guardian unyielding. For a moment, he wanted to surrender, to let the ice swallow him, to vanish into silence. But then he remembered Soyun, her trembling hand, her faint smile, her quiet trust. He remembered the vow. "If you will not open, then I will carry you with me." His lips cracked as he whispered, "I will carry you too." The chains coiled tighter, frost tearing through his skin, but he bowed his shoulders and bore the weight. His spark flickered violently, smaller than ever, trembling on the edge of death. Yet it did not die. The guardian faltered. Its chains trembled, its frost cracking. The throne quaked, fractures running through the ice. One by one, the chains shattered, the frost collapsing into shards. With a roar that shook the cavern, the figure dissolved into mist, its fire extinguished. Only a handful of survivors remained now, their sparks faint, their bodies scarred and trembling. They stood hollow-eyed, staring at the shattered throne. Sungyun collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, blood freezing against the ice. His spark hovered faintly above him, fragile but alive. He had not conquered the Guardian of Frost. He had carried its weight until it broke. The far wall cracked open, revealing another passage into the darkness. Sungyun forced himself upright, his sword trembling in his grip, his vow burning heavier than ever. And once more he stepped forward. The survivors moved onward through the frozen passage, their sparks faint and flickering, their breaths clouding in the frigid air. The walls glistened with ice that creaked faintly, as if the mountain itself resented their intrusion. Each step felt heavier, the silence pressing harder, until even the sound of their own hearts seemed muted by the frost. The tunnel ended abruptly, opening into a cavern vast and suffocating. Its floor was a cracked expanse of stone carved with runes that glowed faintly red. From the walls jutted countless swords, spears, and axes, their edges dulled, their steel blackened with age. The air reeked of rust and blood. At the chamber's center stood a pyre of chains, a tangled spire that reached toward the unseen ceiling, its core burning faintly with crimson fire. The survivors froze. Sparks flickered uneasily. Then the weapons in the walls shuddered. One by one, they tore themselves free, flying across the cavern to orbit the pyre. Blades, spears, and axes whirled in circles of fire and steel, forming a storm that filled the chamber. From within the storm emerged warriors wrought of ash and flame, their bodies seared, their faces hollow. Each carried a weapon that pulsed with the same crimson glow as the pyre's core. The battle began instantly. The storm of weapons struck with merciless speed, steel singing as it cut through sparks and flesh alike. Survivors cried out, lightning crackling, fire roaring, blades clashing desperately. But the storm did not falter. Every weapon shattered was drawn back to the pyre, reforged in fire, and hurled again. Sungyun staggered as an axe slashed across his shoulder. Blood sprang across the stone. His spark flickered violently, trembling faintly above him. His sword felt heavier than ever, his arms weak, his chest burning. The whispers filled his ears, carried by the storm. "You are nothing. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself." His knees buckled. His vision blurred. His spark shrank to a fragile ember. Around him, survivors fell one by one, their sparks extinguished, their bodies torn apart by steel and fire. The cavern became a slaughterhouse of echoes. For a moment, he wanted to surrender, to let the storm cut him down, to let the fire devour him, to fall and vanish. But then he remembered Soyun, her fragile hand, her faint smile, her quiet trust. He remembered the vow, "If you will not open, then I will carry you with me." His lips bled as he whispered, "I will carry you too." The storm raged around him, weapons slashing, fire searing, chains lashing. He bowed his shoulders, enduring the storm's weight instead of resisting. His body broke further with every strike, his spark trembling violently, shrinking smaller than ever. Yet it did not die. The pyre quaked. Its fire flickered, uncertain. The weapons slowed, their orbit faltering. One by one, they clattered lifelessly to the floor. The warriors of ash dissolved into smoke, their sparks vanishing. With a final shudder, the pyre collapsed inward. Its fire extinguished, only a handful of survivors remained, fewer than ever, their sparks faint and trembling. They stood among the ruin of steel, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. Sungyun collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, blood dripping onto the cracked stone. His spark hovered faintly above him, fragile but unbroken. He had not conquered the storm of weapons. He had carried it until it yielded. The far wall split open, revealing another passage into the mountain's depths. Sungyun forced himself upright, his sword trembling in his grip, his vow heavier than ever. And once more he stepped into the darkness. The survivors pressed deeper into the mountain's bowels, their sparks faint lanterns trembling above them. The corridor twisted sharply, the stone walls pressing close, streaked with dark stains that neither water nor blood could fully explain. The silence was unbearable, so complete it seemed to devour even thought. Every step felt like trespassing into a tomb that had waited centuries for them. At last, the passage opened into a cavern vast and haunting. Its floor was carved into concentric rings, each lined with runes that glowed faintly gold. At the chamber's center rose a pedestal of white stone, upon which rested an hourglass larger than a man. Its frame was wrought of bone and chain, its glass filled not with sand, but with ash that drifted downward slowly, grain by grain, glowing faintly as it fell. The survivors froze at the threshold. Their sparks flickered uneasily. The air here was not hot nor cold, it was timeless. As if the cavern itself had been carved outside of life and death. The ash within the hourglass began to fall faster. The runes around the rings blazed brighter, and from the glow stepped figures, wraiths of time itself. Their forms were cloaked in shadow, their faces hidden, their hands skeletal. Each carried an hourglass of their own, small and faint, yet burning with pale fire. The wraiths moved in silence. With every step they took, sparks flickered violently, dimming as if years had been stolen in an instant. Survivors cried out, lightning splitting the air, fire blazing, blades striking desperately. But the wraiths did not falter. Every strike passed through them like mist, and each touch of their skeletal hands drained life from flesh, time from sparks. One survivor screamed as their hair turned white in an instant, their body collapsing into ash before the spark above them was snuffed out. Another tried to run, only to crumble into dust before reaching the wall. Sungyun staggered as a wraith's hand grazed his shoulder. Agony lanced through him, not of pain, but of years stolen in a breath. His limbs felt heavy, his breath shallow. His spark flickered violently, trembling faintly above him. The whispers filled his ears. "You are nothing. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself." His knees buckled. His chest burned. His vision swam as his spark dimmed to a fragile ember. Around him, survivors fell one by one, their sparks extinguished, their bodies dissolving into dust. For a heartbeat. He wanted to surrender, to let the years strip him bare, to vanish into silence. But then he remembered Soyun, her trembling hand, her faint smile, her quiet trust. He remembered the vow, "If you will not open, then I will carry you with me." His lips cracked as he whispered, "I will carry you too." The wraiths pressed closer, their hourglasses glowing brighter. But Sungyun bowed his shoulders and bore their weight. His body broke beneath the stolen years, his spark trembling violently, smaller than ever. Yet it did not die. The great hourglass at the chamber's center shuddered. Its ash faltered, its glow dimming. The wraiths froze mid-step, their forms trembling, their hourglasses cracking. One by one they dissolved into smoke, their fire extinguished. With a thunderous crack, the great hourglass shattered, ash scattering across the cavern like dying stars. Only a handful of survivors remained, fewer than ever, their sparks faint and trembling. They stood among the dust of years, hollow-eyed, their bodies scarred and bent beneath invisible weight. Sungyun collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, his blood staining the stone. His spark hovered faintly above him, fragile but unyielding. He had not conquered time. He had carried it until it broke. The far wall split open, revealing another passage into the mountain's endless dark. Sungyun forced himself upright, his vow burning heavier than ever, his sword trembling in his grip. And once more, he stepped forward. The survivors pressed onward through the new corridor, their sparks faint and fragile, as if each one hovered at the edge of extinguishing. The air here was thick, not with smoke or frost, but with silence so heavy it seemed to press against their lungs. Every step felt like a trespass into a place that had been waiting not for challengers, but for sacrifices. The tunnel ended abruptly, opening into a cavern so immense that its far walls were lost to shadow. The ground was covered in dust, smooth and undisturbed as though no one had crossed here for centuries. At the cavern's center rose a circle of altars, each carved from black stone, each chained to the ground. Upon every altar lay a single, unlit lantern. The survivors froze. Sparks flickered nervously above them. Their glow reflected faintly in the empty lanterns. Then the chains rattled. The lanterns lit one by one, their flames pale and blue. From each flame stepped a figure-robed silhouettes with hollow faces, their bodies stitched together by fire and chain. Each carried a lantern in one hand, and within its glow trembled sparks stolen from the fallen. The battle erupted instantly. The lantern-bearers advanced, their flames lashing outward like whips. Survivors cried out, their sparks flaring desperately. Lightning carved arcs across the cavern, fire roared, steel clanged against chains. But every strike was absorbed by the lanterns. The more the survivors fought, the brighter the flames grew, feeding on their desperation. One survivor screamed as a chain lashed their throat, dragging their spark into a lantern's glow. Their body crumbled, their light trapped forever in the cold fire. Another was seized mid-stride, their spark extinguished in silence. Sungyeon staggered as a chain struck his chest, searing through flesh. His spark flickered violently, trembling faintly above him. His sword slipped in his hand, his body screaming to collapse. The whispers rose from the lanterns, cold and cruel. You are nothing. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself. His knees buckled. His breath faltered. His spark shrank to a fragile ember. Around him, survivors fell one by one, their spark swallowed into the pale flames. For a moment, he wanted to surrender, to let the chains drag him into the lantern, to vanish into silence like the rest. But then he remembered Soyun, her trembling hand, her faint smile, her quiet trust. He remembered the vow, if you will not open, then I will carry you with me. His lips cracked as he whispered, I will carry you too. The chains lashed again. The flames seared hotter, but he bowed his shoulders and bore them. His spark trembled violently, smaller than ever, but it did not die. His endurance unsettled the flames. The lantern-bearers faltered, their fires flickering uncertainly. One by one, the lanterns cracked. The pale flames sputtered, sparks escaping into the air. The figures collapsed into ash, their chains clattering lifelessly to the ground. With a final shudder, the last lantern shattered, its fire extinguished. Only a handful of survivors remain now, their sparks faint, their eyes hollow. They stood in silence among the broken altars, trembling beneath the weight of all they had lost. Sungyeon collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, his blood dripping onto the dust. His spark hovered faintly above him, fragile but alive. He had not conquered the lantern-bearers. He had carried their weight until they broke. The far wall split open, revealing another passage into the mountain's endless dark. Sungyeon forced himself upright, his sword trembling in his grip, his vow burning heavier than ever. And once more, he stepped forward. The survivors trudged through the corridor, beyond the shattered lanterns, their sparks faint above them, trembling like dying embers clinging to the night. The air grew heavy, tinged with the scent of sulfur and smoke. The stone beneath their feet was scorched black, as though fire had once swept through here and never truly left. The tunnel ended in a cavern vast and circular, its walls cracked and jagged, glowing faintly with red veins of molten stone. The ceiling was lost in shadow, but from it hung chains glowing with ember light, dripping sparks like falling ash. At the chamber's center yawned a pit of fire, its surface roiling, its breath filling the cavern with heat. Upon the flames floated a platform of black stone, suspended by chains anchored to the walls. The survivors froze. Their sparks flickered violently as the fire roared. From the pit rose figures, demons forged of molten rock and chain, their eyes burning coals, their mouths gaping maws of flame. Each dragged behind them a trail of molten links that hissed as they struck the ground. The battle began at once. The demons surged across the chains that spanned the pit, their fire searing, their chains lashing. Survivors cried out, sparks flaring desperately. Lightning cracked against molten skin, fire clashed against fire, blades rang against chains. The cavern became a storm of brilliance and flame, but the demons did not falter. For everyone struck down, another clawed its way from the fire. Survivors were dragged screaming into the pit, their sparks consumed in a blaze that left nothing but ash. One by one, the embers of life winked out, swallowed by the roar. Sungyun staggered as a chain lashed his back, burning deep into flesh. His spark flickered violently, trembling faintly above him. His grip on the sword slipped, his chest heaving, his vision swimming in heat. The whispers rose from the fire, "You are nothing. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself." His knees buckled. The heat suffocated him, searing his lungs, burning his veins. His spark dimmed to a fragile ember. Around him, survivors fell one after another, their sparks devoured by the flames. For a heartbeat, he wanted to let go, to fall into the fire, to vanish, to end the weight he bore. But then he remembered Soyeon, her trembling hand, her faint smile, her quiet trust. He remembered the vow. "If you will not open, then I will carry you with me." His lips bled as he whispered, "I will carry you too." The chains struck again. The fire roared hotter, but he bowed his shoulders and bore it. His spark flickered violently, smaller than ever, but it did not die. His endurance unsettled the flames. The demons faltered, their burning eyes dimming. The chains that bound the platform cracked, snapping one by one. With a final roar, the fire pit collapsed inward, flames sinking into silence. The demons dissolved into ash, their chains clattering lifelessly onto the scorched stone. Only a handful of survivors remained, fewer than ever, their sparks faint and trembling. They stood hollow-eyed, trembling with exhaustion, their faces marked by fire and fear. Sungyun collapsed to his knees, his chest scorched, his blood boiling in his veins. His spark hovered faintly above him, fragile but alive. He had not conquered the demons of fire. He had carried their weight until they yielded. The far wall split open, revealing another passage carved into shadow. Sungyun rose slowly, his sword trembling in his grip, his vow heavier than ever. And once more he stepped forward. The survivors pressed into the next corridor, their sparks faint and trembling above them, no brighter than the glow of dying candles. The air grew stale, thick with the stench of rot, as though the mountain itself had begun to decay. Every step echoed too loudly, the silence waiting to swallow it whole. The tunnel bent sharply and opened into a cavern immense and suffocating. Its floor was a field of graves, mounds of stone marked by chains, each grave crowned with a broken weapon or shattered helm. The walls were lined with statues of mourners, their stone faces twisted in grief, their hands stretched outward as if to hold on to something long gone. At the center of the cavern stood a mausoleum of black stone. Its doors chained shut, its surface carved with runes that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. The survivors froze. Sparks flickered violently, uneasy under the mausoleum's presence. Then the chains snapped. The doors groaned open, and from within stepped figures, pale wraiths clad in burial shrouds, their eyes hollow sockets filled with pale fire. They carried no weapons, only the weight of their touch, which drained sparks from flesh and left nothing behind but emptiness. The battle began instantly. The wraiths glided across the grave field, chains dragging behind them, their hollow hands reaching. Survivors cried out, sparks blazing desperately. Lightning cracked, fire roared, blades struck through pale flesh. But the wraiths did not fall. For everyone cut down, another crawled from the mausoleum, endless and merciless. One survivor screamed as a wraith's hand pierced their chest, pulling their spark free in a single motion. Another collapsed silently, their spark extinguished the instant a chain wrapped around their throat. The cavern filled with the sound of sparks breaking. Sungyun staggered as a wraith's touch grazed his arm. Agony flooded him, not pain, but emptiness, a hollowing that made him feel less than human. His spark flickered violently, shrinking to a fragile ember. His sword shook in his grip, his knees buckling. The whispers rose, cold and merciless. "You are nothing. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself." His breath caught. His vision blurred. Around him, survivors crumbled one by one, their sparks torn from them, devoured by the endless dead. For a heartbeat, he wanted to collapse, to let the emptiness swallow him, to vanish with the rest. But then he remembered Soyeon, her fragile hand, her faint smile, her quiet trust. He remembered the vow, "If you will not open, then I will carry you with me." His lips bled as he whispered, "I will carry you too." The wraiths pressed closer, their chains coiling, their hollow hands grasping. Sungyun bowed his shoulders, bearing the emptiness itself. His spark flickered violently, smaller than ever, trembling on the edge of extinction. Yet it did not die. The mausoleum shuddered. The wraiths faltered, their fire dimming. One by one they dissolved into smoke, their chains clattering lifelessly onto the grave field. With a final groan, the mausoleum collapsed inward, its runes extinguishing in silence. Only a handful of survivors remained now. Fewer than ever, their sparks faint, their eyes hollow. They stood among the graves, trembling, their breaths shallow. Sungyun collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, his blood staining the stone. His spark hovered faintly above him, fragile but unyielding. He had not conquered the wraiths of the mausoleum. He had carried their weight until they broke. The far wall cracked open, revealing another passage into the mountain's endless dark. Sungyun forced himself upright, his sword trembling in his grip, his vow burning heavier than ever. And once more, he stepped forward. The survivors entered the new passage like echoes of themselves, sparks trembling faintly above their heads, dimmer than they had ever been. The air here was heavy and damp, thick with the smell of mold and stagnant water. Drops fell rhythmically from the ceiling, each splash against stone echoing like the ticking of a clock counting down their end. The corridor twisted sharply before opening into a cavern immense and drowned. Its floor was submerged beneath black water, still and cold, reflecting sparks faintly like stars in a night sky too dark to hold them. The walls were slick, glistening with moss, and from the ceiling hung chains that dipped into the water, their ends vanishing beneath the surface. At the chamber's center rose a platform of cracked stone, surrounded by the dark pool. The survivors froze at the threshold. Sparks flickered violently, uneasy in the cavern's breathless silence. Then the water stirred. Figures rose from the black depths, drowned corpses bound in chains, their flesh pale and bloated, their eyes glowing faint fire. Water poured from their mouths as they staggered forward, dragging their chains across the surface with a sound like knives on stone. The battle erupted instantly. The drowned lunged across the water, chains lashing, claws raking. Survivors cried out, sparks flaring desperately. Lightning split the dark. Fire hissed into steam. Blades struck through rotting flesh. But the drowned did not fall. For everyone shattered, two more rose from the depths. One survivor was seized mid-step, dragged screaming into the water. Bubbles rose, then nothing. Another tried to flee across the platform, only to be pulled beneath by chains, their spark vanishing into the black. Sungyun staggered as a drowned's claw raked his side, blood spilling into the water. His spark flickered violently, trembling faintly above him. The cold seeped into his bones, the chains coiled around his arms, dragging him down. The whispers rose from the water itself. You are nothing. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself. His chest burned as water filled his lungs. His vision blurred, his spark dimming to a fragile ember. For a heartbeat, he wanted to surrender, to sink into the dark, to let the silence swallow him, to end. But then he remembered Soyeon, her trembling hand, her faint smile, her quiet trust. He remembered the vow, if you will not open, then I will carry you with me. His lips cracked as he whispered through the water, I will carry you too. The chains tightened. The drowned pressed closer, but he bowed his shoulders and bore the weight. His spark trembled violently, shrinking smaller than ever. Yet it did not die. The water roared. The drowned shuddered, their fire eyes dimming. One by one, they dissolved into the black depths, their chains sinking with them. The cavern stilled, the surface smooth once more. Only a handful of survivors remained, fewer than ever. They stood trembling on the platform, their sparks faint, their eyes hollow. Sungyun collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, water dripping from his lips, blood staining the stone. His spark hovered faintly above him, fragile but unyielding. He had not conquered the drowned. He had carried their weight until they yielded. The far wall cracked, stone splitting open to reveal another passage into the endless dark. Sungyun rose slowly, his sword trembling in his grip, his vow heavier than ever. And once more, he stepped forward. The survivors stumbled onward, their sparks trembling like faint embers on the edge of vanishing. The air was suffocating, thick with dust and the stench of rust. The corridor pressed in tighter with every step, stone walls etched with scratches and grooves as if countless hands had clawed desperately to escape. The silence grew unbearable, broken only by the faint rattle of chains that seemed to echo from nowhere and everywhere at once. The tunnel ended in a cavern vast and hollow, shaped like an inverted dome. The floor was cracked stone, split into jagged fragments that shifted underfoot. From the ceiling hung chains as thick as tree trunks, swaying faintly as though stirred by breath. At the chamber's center rose a colossus, an enormous statue of a chained warrior, its face shrouded by a helm of iron, its hands bound around a sword driven into the ground. The survivors froze at the threshold. Sparks flickered violently, their light paling before the immense figure. Then the statue moved. Chains snapped free, and the colossus raised its head. Its eyes glowed with crimson fire, and its sword tore free from the ground with a roar that shook the cavern. The survivors cried out, sparks blazing desperately as the battle began. The colossus swung its sword with the weight of mountains, each strike splitting stone, sending shockwaves through the chamber. Survivors scattered, lightning splitting the air, fire roaring, blades clanging uselessly against iron flesh. But the colossus did not falter. Its chains lashed outward, smashing bodies, extinguishing sparks. One survivor was crushed beneath its heel, their sparks snuffed out instantly. Another was hurled into the ceiling, their body breaking before falling lifeless. Sungyun staggered as the sword struck near him, the shockwave hurling him across the cavern. He landed hard, blood spilling from his mouth, his spark flickering violently. His body screamed to collapse, his grip on the sword slipping. The whispers rose from the chains themselves. You are nothing. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself. His chest heaved. His vision blurred. His spark dimmed to a fragile ember. Around him, survivors fell one after another, their sparks vanishing into silence. For a moment, he wanted to surrender, to let the weight of the colossus crush him, to end beneath its chains. But then he remembered Soyun, her trembling hand, her faint smile, her quiet trust. He remembered the vow, if you will not open, then I will carry you with me. His lips bled as he whispered, I will carry you too. The colossus raised its sword again, chains rattling, crimson fire blazing, but Sungyun bowed his shoulders and bore the weight. His body tore beneath the strain, his spark flickering violently, smaller than ever. Yet it did not die. The colossus faltered. Cracks spread across its iron body, its fire dimming. The chains trembled, snapping one by one. With a roar that shook the chamber, the colossus collapsed inward, its body shattering into fragments of stone and steel. Only a handful of survivors remained now, fewer than ever. Their sparks faint, their eyes hollow. They stood among the ruins of the fallen giant, trembling in silence. Sungyun collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, his blood staining the fractured floor. His spark hovered faintly above him, fragile but alive. He had not conquered the colossus. He had carried its weight until it yielded. The far wall split open, stone groaning, revealing another passage into the mountain's endless dark. Sungyun rose slowly, his vow heavier than ever, his sword trembling in his grip. And once more, he stepped forward. The last survivors staggered into the final passage, their sparks trembling faintly above them. So fragile they seemed ready to vanish at the slightest touch of wind. The corridor was long and straight, unlike the twisting veins that had come before. Its walls were carved with chains upon chains, an endless mural of binding, each link etched deep into the stone. The air was heavy, metallic, and every breath scraped like iron down their throats. At the end of the corridor lay a cavern larger than all the others combined. The ceiling was lost in shadow, the floor an expanse of cracked stone. Chains hung from the void above, countless and unending, descending into the chamber like roots of a colossal tree. At the very center stood a throne of black steel, forged from the interwoven links of chains. Upon it sat a figure cloaked in darkness, its eyes burning with a pale, merciless fire. The survivors froze. Sparks flickered violently, their dim light paling before the presence on the throne. Then the figure moved. Chains erupted from the throne, lashing outward with the force of a storm. Survivors screamed as they were caught mid-step, dragged across the floor, their sparks torn from them in an instant. The figure rose, towering, its body not flesh but chains woven together, each link glowing faintly with sparks imprisoned within. The battle began. Lightning split the chamber, fire roared, blades clashed desperately against steel. But every strike vanished into the chains. The figure absorbed it all, feeding on their fury, growing stronger with each blow. Survivors fell one after another, their sparks devoured into the throne's glow. Sungyun staggered as a chain tore across his back, ripping flesh. His spark flickered violently, shrinking to a fragile ember. His sword felt impossibly heavy, his body screaming to collapse. The whispers rose louder than ever, echoing from every chain, every spark consumed. You are nothing. You cannot carry her. You cannot even carry yourself. His knees buckled. His vision blurred. His breath came ragged, shallow. Around him, the last of the survivors were torn apart, their sparks extinguished. The chamber became silent, but for the endless rattle of chains, for a heartbeat, he wanted to surrender. To bow his head, to let the throne consume him, to become just another link in the endless wait. But then he remembered Soyun. Her trembling hand, her faint smile, her quiet trust. He remembered the vow whispered when no one else could hear. If you will not open, then I will carry you with me. His lips bled as he whispered, louder than the chains, I will carry you too. The figure on the throne surged forward, chains wrapping around him, crushing bone, tearing flesh. Agony roared through him, his body shattering under the strain. Yet he bowed his shoulders and bore it. His spark flickered violently, smaller than ever, a thread of light against a storm of darkness. But it did not die. The throne trembled. The chains shuddered. The imprisoned sparks within its body flickered, wavering uncertainly. Sungyun's spark, fragile yet unyielding, pulled against the weight of all those chained lights. One by one they responded, trembling, breaking free. The figure roared, its form unraveling. Chains snapped, sparks burst into the air, filling the chamber like a storm of stars. The throne collapsed inward, fragments scattering across the stone. Silence fell. Only Songyun remained, broken and bleeding, his spark faint above him. Around him, the chamber lay in ruins, chains shattered, sparks drifting free like fireflies escaping into the night. He collapsed to his knees, his sword clattering to the stone. His breath was ragged, his body broken beyond repair. But his spark, fragile, trembling, impossibly small, still hovered above him. He had not conquered the throne of chains. He had carried its weight until it shattered. For a long moment, he knelt in silence, watching the sparks drift upward into the endless dark. Somewhere among them he imagined Soyun's light, faint and trusting, carried with him to the very end. And then, with nothing left but his vow, Sungyun closed his eyes and stepped into the dark.